We begin with the world Joan of Arc was born into, because understanding her life requires understanding the turmoil of France in the early 15th century. Joan was born in 1412 in the small village of Domrémy, located in the region of Lorraine, in the northeast of France. This was a rural place, surrounded by fields, forests, and the steady rhythm of agricultural life. The people of Domrémy were peasants, bound to the cycles of planting and harvest, and deeply shaped by the traditions of the Catholic Church. The simplicity of this life makes the dramatic turn of Joan's story all the more striking. She was not born into nobility or wealth. She began as an ordinary girl in an extraordinary time. That time was defined by the 100 Years' War, a long conflict between France and England that had begun in 1337 and would not end until 1453, long after Joan's death. When Joan was a child, France was fractured. The war was not only between the French and English, but also between different French factions. One faction supported the Dauphin Charles, who would later become Charles VII. Another faction supported the English and their allies, the Burgundians. This meant that the kingdom Joan was born into was not a united France, but a land torn by division and instability. The war had taken a toll on ordinary people. Villages were often raided, crops destroyed, and families displaced. Joan's own village of Domrémy sat near a contested border. It was not a safe or peaceful childhood environment. Still, within that instability, she grew up in a family of farmers. Her father, Jacques d'Arc, was a peasant farmer of some means, though not wealthy. Her mother, Isabelle Romay, was known for her deep piety, teaching Joan her prayers and grounding her in the practices of Catholic devotion. Religion was central to daily life in 15th century France. Every village had its parish church, and the rhythm of the year followed the church calendar. Children were raised on the stories of the saints, who were presented as models of courage and holiness. Joan absorbed these lessons deeply. From an early age, she was said to be devout, attending Mass frequently, and spending long hours in prayer. This seriousness about faith would later distinguish her from other young people of her age. It is important to remember that the France of Joan's youth was a land in crisis. The English occupied large parts of northern France, including Paris. The French king, Charles VI, was incapacitated by mental illness, leaving his heir, the Dauphin Charles, with a weak claim and little support. Many French nobles had aligned themselves with the English cause. The French crown itself was uncertain, and the legitimacy of Charles was widely doubted. Against this backdrop, the story of a peasant girl who would come to lead armies seems even more improbable. Joan's childhood years in Domrémy gave her first-hand experience of the war. There were raids in the area, sometimes forcing villagers to flee for safety. These were formative events. They impressed upon her the suffering of her people and the need for deliverance. Unlike a noble child, raised in castles and courts, Joan's understanding of war was from the ground up through the hardship of peasants who carried the burdens of conflict. The daily life of a peasant girl like Joan involved work in the household and fields. She helped her mother with tasks such as spinning, sewing, and tending livestock. Accounts suggest that she was skilled in these domestic duties. Yet even as she carried out this simple work, her mind was drawn to matters of faith. Witnesses later testified that she was unusually pious, avoiding the games and distractions of other children. She devoted herself to prayer, showing early signs of the intense spiritual focus that would later define her. By the time Joan reached her teenage years, the war had reached a desperate phase for the French. The English, with Burgundian allies, were pressing deeper into France. The great city of Orléans was under siege, and its fall would likely mean the collapse of the Dauphin's cause. In this environment of despair, rumors and prophecies circulated widely. Many people believed that France was destined to be saved by a virgin maiden. Such beliefs set the stage for Joan's appearance. But before we arrive at Joan's visions and her decision to act, it is important to pause on her early character. She was not taught to read or write, which was typical for a peasant girl of her time, yet she possessed what contemporaries described as a natural intelligence, a quick memory, and an ability to speak with conviction. These qualities, combined with her deep faith, made her stand out among her peers. Domrémy itself became part of her identity. In later life, when questioned at her trial, Joan often referred to herself as Joan la Pucelle, meaning Joan the Maid, a reference to her virginity. But she also rooted her identity in her origins. She was the daughter of Domrémy, a humble background that underscored the extraordinary nature of her rise. As we reflect on her early life, we see the foundations of her later role: a childhood in a land at war, a household steeped in faith, a girl who worked in the fields but spent her heart in prayer, a village that knew fear and displacement, but also resilience. All of these shaped the young Joan, preparing her for the extraordinary claims she would later make and the actions she would take. In the next segment, we will move into the pivotal moment of Joan's adolescence. When she reported hearing voices and experiencing visions, these visions would become the defining turning point of her life, setting her on the path from a peasant village to the courts of kings and the fields of battle. As we continue the story, we move from Joan's childhood in Domrémy to the turning point of her adolescence, when she began to report visions and voices that guided her future path. This part of her life has been debated and analyzed for centuries, yet it remains central to understanding how a young peasant girl could believe herself chosen to lead armies and influence the fate of kingdoms. Joan herself testified later in life that these experiences began when she was around 13 years old. She described being out in the fields during the middle of the day, when suddenly she saw a bright light and heard a voice. She explained that at first she was frightened, not knowing what it meant, but over time she became convinced that these voices came from heavenly messengers. She identified them as Saint Michael the Archangel, Saint Catherine of Alexandria, and Saint Margaret. These were well-known saints in the Catholic tradition, each representing ideals of courage, purity, and defense of the faith. Saint Michael, the warrior archangel, was seen as a protector of Christians and a fighter against evil. His presence in Joan's visions reinforced the idea of struggle, protection, and war in service of righteousness. Saint Catherine and Saint Margaret, both virgin martyrs from early Christianity, represented steadfastness in faith, even under persecution. To a devout young girl raised on stories of saints, these figures carried enormous weight. They embodied the ideals Joan already admired and gave her a sense of divine mission. Joan described how the voices urged her to live a pure life, to attend church, and to maintain her virginity. Virginity was not only a personal vow, but also became a key part of her public identity. In the culture of the time, a virgin maiden was believed to have special spiritual authority. When prophecies circulated that France would be delivered by a maiden, Joan's claim fit neatly into these expectations. At first, her visions focused on her personal devotion. They encouraged her to pray, to be good, and to prepare herself for what was to come. Over time, however, the messages grew more specific. The voices told her that she had been chosen to help save France, to support the Dauphin Charles, and to drive out the English. This was an extraordinary claim. For a teenage girl in a small village, the idea of speaking to kings and leading armies was unimaginable. Yet Joan came to believe, with complete certainty, that this was her destiny. The people around her noticed her unusual piety and seriousness, but it is not clear how much she shared at first about her visions. She may have been cautious, knowing that such claims could be doubted or even seen as dangerous. Medieval Europe was full of both genuine religious devotion and suspicion of heresy. Women, in particular, had little authority, and anyone who claimed divine visions risked scrutiny by church authorities. Still, the belief in miracles and divine intervention was strong, and Joan's era was one in which prophecies and signs were often taken seriously. By the time she reached 16 or 17, Joan had become convinced that she could not delay the mission. The voices urged her to go to the Dauphin Charles, who at that time held only a tenuous claim to the French throne. His forces were weak, and the siege of Orléans threatened to end his cause altogether. The voices told Joan that she must help lift the siege and see Charles crowned as the rightful king. For Joan, this was not just an idea, but a divine command. To modern listeners, the question of what Joan actually experienced has often been raised. Some have suggested that she may have had vivid religious experiences shaped by her faith and the culture of her time. Others have speculated about medical or psychological explanations. Yet within her own context, her visions were not treated as impossible. Medieval Europe was filled with accounts of visions, apparitions, and voices from the divine. For Joan and those who came to believe in her, these experiences were real and authoritative. It is also important to understand the political atmosphere in which Joan began to speak about her mission. The Dauphin Charles had been disinherited by the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, which recognized Henry V of England as heir to the French crown through his marriage to Catherine of Valois. After Henry V's death, his infant son Henry VI was declared king of both England and France, supported by the powerful Burgundian faction. This left Charles with little legitimacy and even less power. His cause seemed doomed unless something extraordinary occurred. Into this desperate situation stepped Joan, a peasant girl with no military training, no noble lineage, and no wealth. Yet she came claiming a divine message, declaring that God had chosen her to lead France to victory. The boldness of this claim was astonishing, and yet for a country in despair, the appearance of such a figure could provide hope. When Joan finally revealed her mission to those around her, reactions were mixed. Some doubted her, but others were struck by her sincerity and conviction. She persuaded a local nobleman, Robert de Baudricourt, who commanded the nearby garrison at Vaucouleurs, to give her support. At first he dismissed her, but as she persisted, and as news of her determination spread, he relented and provided her with an escort to travel to the Dauphin's court. This was the beginning of Joan's extraordinary public mission. The voices and visions thus marked the dividing line in her life. Before them, she was a peasant girl of Domrémy, devoted to prayer and daily labor. After them, she became a figure convinced of divine purpose, willing to challenge the structures of her world, to obey what she believed was God's command. As we close this segment, we can see how these visions set her on a collision course with history. In the next part, we will follow her journey to meet the Dauphin Charles, a journey filled with obstacles, uncertainty, and the beginnings of her recognition as someone extraordinary. We now follow Joan as she takes the bold step from her rural village toward the world of courts and kings. The visions she described had given her a clear mission to aid the Dauphin Charles and see him crowned as the rightful king of France. But the path from Domrémy to Charles's court was neither direct nor easy. It involved persuasion, risk, and remarkable determination for a teenage peasant girl. By 1428 and 1429, the war was reaching a critical moment. The English and their Burgundian allies controlled much of northern France, including Paris. The city of Orléans, on the Loire River, was under siege. If Orléans fell, the remaining lands, loyal to the Dauphin, would likely collapse. For Charles, the situation was desperate. His authority was fragile, his supporters divided, and his military prospects dim. Against this backdrop, Joan set out to convince him that she was the answer. Her first step was to gain support from those near her. She turned to Robert de Baudricourt, the captain of Vaucouleurs, a small fortress town not far from Domrémy. Baudricourt was a practical military man. When Joan approached him with the claim that God had sent her to help the Dauphin, his reaction was predictable. He dismissed her. The idea that a teenage peasant girl could play any role in the war seemed absurd to him, but Joan was persistent. Accounts tell us that she repeatedly visited Baudricourt, insisting that she must be given an escort to see the Dauphin. She spoke with confidence, describing her divine mission. At first, he told her to go home to her father. But Joan did not give up. Over time, her persistence, sincerity, and perhaps the growing desperation of the political situation began to shift opinions. Some local villagers and soldiers came to believe in her. She was said to have made bold predictions, such as the lifting of the siege of Orléans, which encouraged belief in her mission. Eventually, Baudricourt relented. He provided her with a small escort of armed men to accompany her on the dangerous journey across territory, contested by the English and Burgundians. Before departing, Joan is said to have cut her hair short and dressed in male clothing. This decision, both practical and symbolic, would remain central to her identity. Wearing male military attire gave her protection on the road and in camp, but it also marked her as someone apart, someone set aside for a special mission. The journey to Charles's court at Chinon was long and dangerous. Joan and her escort traveled over 300 miles, crossing rivers, forests, and regions where enemy patrols could be encountered at any moment. They often traveled at night to avoid detection. The group passed through hostile territory, including lands controlled by the Burgundians. At several points, they faced the risk of capture or ambush. The fact that they reached Chinon safely added to the sense of Joan's mission being protected or guided. When Joan arrived at Chinon in early 1429, she faced another challenge, gaining an audience with the Dauphin. Charles was surrounded by advisors and courtiers, many of whom would have viewed her claim with suspicion. After all, France had seen prophets and visionaries before, and not all were taken seriously. Yet Charles was desperate enough that he allowed her to appear before him. The meeting at Chinon has become one of the most famous moments in Joan's story. According to tradition, Charles decided to test her. He dressed in ordinary clothes and stood among his courtiers, while another man took his place in regal attire. When Joan entered, she walked directly to Charles, ignoring the decoy, and addressed him as the rightful heir. This act convinced many that she had special insight, for it seemed she could recognize him by divine guidance. Joan spoke with Charles privately, and the details of that conversation are not fully known. Later accounts suggest that she reassured him, telling him that God had chosen him to be king and that she would help him secure his crown. Some reports say she revealed secrets known only to him, deepening his confidence in her. Whatever was said, the outcome was that Charles did not dismiss her. He agreed to put her claims to further testing. Before Joan could be entrusted with any role in the war, she had to be examined by church authorities. Charles sent her to Poitiers, where theologians and clerics questioned her extensively. They wanted to determine whether her visions were of divine origin or whether she might be deceived or dangerous. Joan held firm in her testimony. She spoke with clarity and conviction, presenting herself as a humble servant of God. She insisted that she was a maiden sent by divine command. The examiners found no fault in her faith or character, and many came to believe that she was genuine. Another step was taken to confirm her mission. she was sent to Orléans with a letter of support. But before her departure, she was outfitted in armor, given a banner, and placed in the company of soldiers. For the first time, Joan of Arc was stepping into the role that would define her, leading men in battle. This transformation was astonishing. In just a few months, she had gone from a peasant village to the court of the Dauphin, passed examination by theologians, and been accepted as a figure of divine mission. Her confidence and determination impressed those who met her. Even hardened soldiers, skeptical at first, came to respect her presence. Her banner, which she would carry into battle, was painted with holy images, including Christ in judgment and the names of Jesus and Mary. For Joan, the banner was more than a symbol. She often said she loved her banner more than her sword, for it represented her divine mission and the protection of God over France. As Joan prepared to march toward Orléans, the weight of expectation grew. The city had been under siege for months, and its defenders were exhausted, supplies were running low, and morale was collapsing. The arrival of a maiden claiming to be sent by God offered hope at a moment when all seemed lost. For the Dauphin Charles, sending her was a risk, but it was also a chance. If she succeeded, his cause might be revived. The journey to Charles and her acceptance at court marked the beginning of Joan's public mission. It was the first proof that she could overcome doubt, persuade powerful men, and gain recognition despite her humble origins. But the true test lay ahead, not in words or visions, but on the battlefield. In the next segment, we will follow Joan to Orléans, where she would make her first dramatic appearance as a leader in war, changing not only the course of the siege, but the morale of an entire nation. We now move with Joan of Arc to the moment that first brought her to national attention: her arrival at Orléans in April 1429. The city had been under siege by the English since the previous October, and the outcome of this battle would decide much of the future course of the war. For the French cause, Orléans was critical. If it fell, the Dauphin Charles' position might collapse entirely. If it held, hope for the kingdom could be restored. Into this desperate situation came Joan, the young maiden who claimed divine mission. The siege of Orléans had dragged on for months. The English had encircled the city with strong fortifications and outposts, cutting off supplies and reinforcements. Inside the walls, the citizens and defenders were weary and increasingly hopeless. Food was scarce, morale was low, and the French commanders had made little progress in breaking the siege. The English believed victory was only a matter of time. They called Orléans the key to the Loire Valley, and they were confident that once it fell, Charles's hopes of claiming the throne would be finished. Joan's arrival was carefully staged to boost morale. She was outfitted in armor, riding a horse, and carrying her banner. Witnesses described her as striking in appearance, not because of beauty or grandeur, but because of her sense of purpose. To the weary defenders of Orléans, the sight of this young woman, claiming to be sent by God, brought fresh energy. People gathered to see her, to touch her, and to draw strength from her presence. She was not a general in the traditional sense, but her effect on morale was immediate and powerful. Joan entered the city on April 29. The people greeted her with joy, seeing her as a sign of divine favor. For months, rumors had circulated that a maiden would come to save France, and now she was here, in their midst. The timing could not have been more critical. Supplies and reinforcements had just managed to reach the city, slipping past the English blockade, and Joan's arrival added to the sense that God had intervened on their behalf. Although she was not trained in strategy, Joan quickly made her presence felt among the commanders. She urged them to take decisive action, to attack the English fortifications, and to put their trust in God. Her courage and certainty challenged the hesitation that had marked French efforts up to that point. Some commanders were skeptical, preferring to proceed cautiously, but Joan pressed for bold action. She believed delay showed a lack of faith, and she insisted that victory was possible. One of Joan's most important contributions was her effect on discipline and morale among the troops. She encouraged the soldiers to confess their sins, attend Mass, and avoid swearing or looting. She reminded them constantly that they were fighting for God and for France. In a time when soldiers were often unruly and undisciplined, this spiritual encouragement made a difference. She gave them not only confidence, but also a sense of higher purpose. Within days of her arrival, Joan led the French in a series of attacks on the English positions surrounding Orléans. She carried her banner into battle, and her presence inspired the soldiers to press forward. At one key moment, when the French wavered in an assault on the English fortifications, Joan herself advanced with the banner, rallying the men to continue. Her courage on the field became legendary. Even though she was wounded by an arrow in one battle, she refused to retreat and urged the soldiers to carry on. The tide began to turn. One by one, the English strongholds around the city fell to French assaults. The defenders of Orléans gained confidence with each victory, while the English, who had thought the city was nearly theirs, grew demoralized. By May 8, 1429, less than 2 weeks after John's arrival, the siege was lifted, the English retreated, and Orléans was saved. The lifting of the siege was a turning point in the war. For the French, it was more than a military victory. It was a sign that God was with them, that their cause was just, and that hope was not lost. Joan was celebrated as the Maid of Orléans, a title she would carry for the rest of her life. Her reputation spread quickly across France. To the supporters of Charles, she was a miracle sent from heaven. To the English, she became a figure of fear and hatred, described as a witch or sorceress. For Charles, the victory at Orléans was invaluable. It gave him new credibility and a chance to rally his supporters. He began to see Joan not only as a useful figure, but as essential to his cause. She pressed him to move forward quickly with plans for his coronation, which she believed was commanded by God. The momentum was with the French, and Joan intended to use it. The events at Orléans also highlighted the unusual nature of Joan's role. She was not a strategist in the formal sense, and she did not lead troops through technical commands, but her presence changed the atmosphere of the battlefield. Soldiers believed she carried divine favor, and that belief translated into courage and determination. War is often as much about morale as about numbers, and Joan's gift was to inspire morale at a time when France needed it most. After Orléans, Joan's reputation spread far beyond the city. News traveled quickly across France, carried by messengers, soldiers, and clergy. Ordinary people began to speak of the maiden sent by God. In a kingdom weary from decades of war, famine, and division, her story brought new hope. But Joan herself was not content to stop at Orléans. She believed her mission was not complete until Charles was crowned king in Reims, the traditional site of French coronations. That goal would require a daring march through enemy territory and further battles along the way. Joan pressed Charles to act, urging him to claim his crown and fulfill the will of God. In the next segment, we will follow Joan from Orléans to the campaign along the Loire, where she and the French forces continued their string of victories, pushing back the English and preparing the way for the Dauphin's coronation. With the siege of Orléans lifted, Joan of Arc and the French forces turned their attention to the Loire Valley. This was the next step in her mission, for she believed her divine charge was not just to defend France, but to see Charles crowned as king at Reims. To reach Reims, however, the French first had to secure the Loire region and drive back the English strongholds along the river. The campaign that followed would become a remarkable series of victories, cementing Joan's reputation as more than a symbol. She became a driving force in military success. After Orléans, morale among the French had soared. Soldiers who had once despaired now believed that victory was possible. Word of Joan's courage and inspiration spread quickly, and her presence encouraged men to volunteer and nobles to commit resources. At the same time, the English were shaken. They had been confident of success at Orléans, and their unexpected defeat made them wary. The psychological balance of the war was shifting, and Joan was at the center of this change. The first major target in the Loire campaign was the town of Jargeau, held by the English. Jargeau was a fortified position, and its capture would open the way for further advances. In June 1429, Joan and the French forces launched their attack. As at Orléans, Joan carried her banner into battle, urging the men forward. She was struck on the helmet by a stone at one point. Yet she quickly rose and continued the fight, refusing to withdraw. Her resilience inspired the soldiers, who pressed the assault with determination. Within days, the French had taken Jargeau, forcing the English to retreat. From there, the campaign continued with momentum. The French moved on to Meung-sur-Loire and then Beaugency, both held by the English. In each case, Joan urged bold attacks, and in each case, the French succeeded. The victories were swift and decisive, building confidence and weakening the English position along the river. Joan's leadership style was not based on detailed tactics, but her insistence on faith, courage, and relentless action drove the French forward. One of the most significant encounters came at the Battle of Patay, fought on June 18, 1429. Here the French confronted a larger English force. The English had previously relied heavily on their longbowmen, whose tactics had devastated French knights at earlier battles such as Crécy and Agincourt. But at Patay, the French cavalry, emboldened and aggressive, struck before the English could properly prepare. The English lines were broken, their archers scattered, and their forces routed. It was a complete French victory, and the English losses were heavy. The triumph at Patay was particularly important because it shattered the aura of English invincibility that had hung over the war for decades. Battles like Agincourt had given the English a reputation for unbeatable military skill, but Patay showed that the tide could turn. For Joan and her supporters, this was proof that God's favor was with France. For the English, it was a sobering defeat. In the span of just a few weeks, the French had gone from desperation to dominance along the Loire. Orléans had been saved, key towns had been retaken, and the English had been defeated in open battle. The momentum was now firmly with Charles and his cause. Joan urged him to press forward quickly toward Reims, where he could be crowned. The victories along the Loire also strengthened Joan's standing with the French people. Soldiers spoke of her courage and faith. Commanders who had once doubted her began to respect her influence. Citizens who had endured years of fear now saw hope embodied in the figure of the Maid. Her presence in the camp was not only inspirational, but also moral. She encouraged prayer, banned looting, and insisted on discipline. For many, she seemed to embody the renewal of France itself. It is important to note, however, that not everyone was fully convinced. Some of Charles's advisors remained cautious, suspicious of Joan's claims, or wary of moving too quickly. The idea of relying on a peasant girl with visions was unusual, even unsettling, to the traditional hierarchy of nobles and clerics. Yet the string of victories could not be denied, and Joan's influence grew. For Charles, the victories created an opportunity he could not ignore to solidify his claim. He needed to be crowned king, and that coronation had to take place in Reims, the traditional site where French monarchs were anointed with holy oil, but Reims lay deep in territory, controlled by the Burgundians, allies of the English. Reaching it would be risky, requiring a march through hostile lands. Joan, however, insisted that the way would be opened. She told Charles that God had commanded his coronation, and she urged him to act without hesitation. The Loire campaign thus marked a turning point in the war and in Joan's life. It demonstrated that she was not just a symbolic figure, but someone who could inspire real victories on the battlefield. The French forces, once demoralized and fractured, now marched with confidence, believing they were on the path to reclaiming their kingdom. As the Loire campaign concluded, Joan's thoughts turned increasingly to Reims. She saw the coronation as the fulfillment of her mission, the divine purpose for which she had been sent. To her, the victories were only steps along the way, signs that God's hand was guiding the French toward this decisive moment. In the next segment, we will follow Joan and the Dauphin Charles on the coronation journey, a remarkable march through enemy territory, culminating in the crowning of Charles VII at Reims, with Joan standing by his side. After the victories along the Loire, Joan of Arc pressed the Dauphin Charles to complete what she considered the heart of her mission, his coronation at Reims. For Joan, this was not simply a matter of ceremony. The coronation symbolized divine approval and legitimacy. It was the sacred moment when the king was anointed with holy oil, marking him as chosen by God. Without it, Charles remained a claimant with shaky authority. With it, he would become Charles VII, King of France, in the eyes of his people and the Church. The challenge was geography. Reims lay deep inside territory, controlled by the Burgundians, allies of the English. To reach it, Charles's forces would have to march through hostile lands, risking attack at every stage. Many of his advisors counseled against such a move, seeing it as reckless, but Joan urged him forward with certainty. She insisted that God would open the way, and she encouraged Charles to trust in divine guidance rather than human caution. In June 1429, preparations began. The French army, strengthened by recent victories, gathered to escort the Dauphin. Joan rode with them, armored and carrying her banner, as she had in earlier battles. The march itself became a kind of pilgrimage, a visible declaration that France was reclaiming its destiny. At every town along the route, the people came out to greet Joan and Charles. Many opened their gates willingly, surrendering to the Dauphin without resistance. The presence of Joan, combined with the fresh momentum of French victories, encouraged towns to shift their allegiance. The journey was not without tension. Each new town posed a potential risk, and enemy forces could have attempted to intercept the column. Yet again and again, opposition failed to materialize. Burgundian-held towns hesitated, unsure of their ability to resist, and many chose to join Charles rather than stand against him. It seemed, as Joan had promised, that God was clearing the path. The symbolism of the march was powerful. For decades, France had been divided, its people uncertain of who was their rightful ruler. Now the Dauphin moved steadily toward the sacred site of kingship, accompanied by the Maid, who proclaimed his divine right. The people lining the roads shouted their support, and soldiers marched with renewed confidence. It was not simply an army on the move. It was a nation beginning to believe in itself again. At last, in mid-July 1429, Charles and his entourage reached Reims. The city, though under Burgundian influence, chose not to resist. Its gates opened, and preparations for the coronation began. On July 17, 1429, the ceremony took place in the great cathedral of Reims. The archbishop performed the traditional rite, anointing Charles with the sacred oil preserved from the time of Clovis, the first Christian king of the Franks. In the eyes of the people and the church, Charles became King Charles VII of France. Joan stood beside him during the ceremony, holding her banner. Later she explained that her banner had shared in the labor of battle and therefore deserved the honor of being present at the coronation. For her, this moment was the culmination of the mission her voices had commanded. The Dauphin was no longer merely a claimant. He was now the anointed king, recognized by God and tradition. The atmosphere in the cathedral was one of triumph. After years of defeat and humiliation, France had regained a sense of hope and legitimacy. Those present wept with joy, chanting acclamations for their king. Outside the cathedral, crowds filled the streets, celebrating what seemed like the rebirth of the French kingdom. For Joan, the coronation was deeply personal. She had left her village with the promise that she would see Charles crowned, and now she had fulfilled that promise. She wept during the ceremony, overcome with emotion. Later, she is reported to have said that it was the happiest moment of her life. The coronation also had a profound effect on Charles. Though often cautious and indecisive, he now carried the sacred authority of kingship. His legitimacy was no longer merely political, it was spiritual. This strengthened his position among his supporters and made it harder for enemies to dismiss him as an illegitimate claimant. Yet even in this triumph, challenges remained. The English still held large parts of northern France, including Paris. The Burgundians remained powerful allies of England. The war was far from over. Joan urged Charles to press forward, to march directly on Paris and continue the campaign. She believed momentum was with them and that delay would squander God's favor. Charles, however, was more cautious. His advisors urged consolidation, not reckless advance. This tension between Joan's urgent conviction and Charles's cautious politics would shape the next stage of events. The coronation journey thus marked both the peak of Joan's success and the beginning of new struggles. She had accomplished what seemed impossible, leading the Dauphin through hostile lands to his anointing at Reims. She had transformed morale, restored legitimacy, and become a figure of national inspiration. But her mission, in her eyes, was not yet complete. In the next segment, we will follow Joan and Charles as they turn their attention toward Paris, the symbolic heart of France, and see how her determination collided with political hesitation and military setbacks. After the coronation at Reims, in July 1429, Joan of Arc believed her divine mission was only partly fulfilled. For her, Charles VII was now the rightful king, but much of France remained in English and Burgundian hands. Paris, the kingdom's symbolic and political heart, was still under enemy control. Joan was convinced that momentum was on their side and that God intended them to press forward immediately. She urged Charles to march on Paris without delay, to strike while the English were weakened and the French were inspired by recent victories. The mood among the French was triumphant after Reims. Crowds hailed Joan as the maid who had delivered France. Soldiers were eager, their confidence restored after decades of defeat. Yet within Charles's inner circle, hesitation began to re-emerge. Many of his counselors, still cautious by nature and wary of relying too heavily on Joan's visions, advised against rushing into further battles. They wanted to consolidate the gains, strengthen alliances, and avoid unnecessary risks. Charles himself, often indecisive, leaned toward caution. Despite these reservations, Joan's influence and the enthusiasm of the army carried the day for a time. The march toward Paris began in August 1429. Along the way, several towns opened their gates to Charles, swayed by the presence of the newly crowned king and the reputation of Joan. Each surrender strengthened the sense that God's will was unfolding. Joan rode at the head of the army with her banner, continuing to inspire both soldiers and common people. Yet the campaign toward Paris revealed deeper fractures. France was not united, and the political situation remained complex. The Burgundians controlled much of the territory around the capital and remained firm allies of the English. Charles's advisors preferred negotiation with the Burgundians rather than a direct assault. They argued that diplomacy could secure Paris without risking bloodshed. Joan, however, was impatient with such strategies. She believed delay showed weakness and a lack of faith. To her, the divine mission required action, not compromise. By early September, the French army reached the outskirts of Paris. The city was heavily fortified and defended by English and Burgundian forces. Still, Joan pressed for an immediate attack. On September 8, 1429, she led the assault on the city's defenses. True to her role, she advanced with her banner, encouraging the soldiers to follow. The fighting was fierce, and the defenders resisted stubbornly. During the assault, Joan was wounded by a crossbow bolt to the thigh. Despite the injury, she refused to retreat. She urged the soldiers to continue the attack, but the momentum faltered. Charles, influenced by his cautious advisors, ordered the withdrawal. The attack ended in failure. Paris remained in enemy hands. The failed assault was a turning point. For the first time since Orléans, Joan's certainty had not been matched by victory. The disappointment was sharp, especially for her. She had believed wholeheartedly that God intended Paris to fall, and the setback was difficult for her to accept. For Charles and his advisors, the failure reinforced their caution. They became even less willing to follow Joan's bold strategies. Despite the disappointment, Joan remained determined. She continued to urge further action, but her influence at court began to wane. Charles, now crowned and strengthened in legitimacy, no longer relied on her as heavily as before. Political considerations, alliances, and negotiations increasingly guided his decisions. Joan, still focused on divine mission and military action, found herself at odds with the slow pace of royal politics. The March on Paris showed the limits of Joan's power. She could inspire armies and win battles, but she could not control the king's strategy or overcome the divisions among his counselors. Her vision of a France fully liberated clashed with the realities of politics and war. Yet even in setback, her courage continued to impress those who followed her. Soldiers remembered her standing, wounded but unyielding, urging them forward even as the attack faltered. The failure at Paris did not end her role. Joan remained with the French forces, continuing to participate in smaller campaigns and skirmishes. But the high point of her influence, the triumph of Orléans, the victories of the Loire, and the coronation at Reims, was behind her. The struggle ahead would be harder, with fewer successes and growing resistance from within her own side. Still, Joan's story was not yet over. Her mission, as she understood it, remained incomplete, and she would not give up. In the months that followed, she continued to ride with the army, to press for action, and to hold fast to her faith that God had chosen her to save France. In the next segment, we will follow Joan through the months after Paris, as she faced the challenges of fading influence, continuing battles, and the first signs of the dangers that would ultimately lead to her capture. After the failed assault on Paris in September 1429, Joan of Arc's position began to change. Until then, she had been the driving force of French victories, inspiring armies and urging Charles forward to his coronation. But now, with Paris still in enemy hands, and the king increasingly turning to diplomacy rather than bold military campaigns, Joan's influence at court started to wane. The Maid of Orléans was still admired and respected, but her voice carried less weight in the councils of power. Charles VII, newly crowned, no longer needed Joan in the same way he had before Reims. His legitimacy had been secured through the coronation, and while Joan remained an important symbol, the king began to place greater trust in his traditional advisors. These men were cautious, preferring negotiation and treaties to the risks of further military campaigns. They sought to preserve what had been gained rather than gamble it in new offensives. For Joan, this was a difficult shift. Her visions had not told her to stop after Reims. She believed her mission was to drive the English completely out of France. Every delay, every compromise, felt to her like disobedience to God's will. Yet she was powerless to force the king to act. Her frustration grew as she watched opportunities slip away while political negotiations took center stage. Despite these frustrations, Joan did not withdraw from military life. She continued to ride with the French forces, taking part in smaller campaigns and actions. She was present at skirmishes in the autumn and winter of 1429, urging soldiers to remain disciplined and faithful. Though these actions were not as dramatic as Orléans or Patay, they kept her reputation alive among the troops. Soldiers still looked to her for inspiration, and ordinary people continued to see her as the maiden chosen by God. In late 1429, Joan and her family were rewarded by Charles. Her parents were ennobled, and her village of Domrémy was granted privileges. These honors recognized her service and gave her family a new social standing. Yet for Joan herself, such rewards were not the goal. She wanted victory, liberation, and the fulfillment of her mission. During this period, Joan's presence also became more controversial. Some members of the nobility resented her influence, seeing her as an outsider who had risen too quickly. Clerics debated the meaning of her visions, some supporting her, others doubting. While her popularity among the common people remained strong, her standing among the elite grew more fragile. The winter of 1429 into 1430 was a quieter time militarily, as both sides regrouped. The English remained determined to hold their ground, while the Burgundians continued their alliance with them. Charles explored negotiations with Burgundy, hoping to weaken the alliance that kept Paris out of his hands. Joan, however, pressed for renewed campaigns. She did not believe peace with the Burgundians would last, and she wanted to keep the momentum of the previous summer alive. Her persistence kept her active in the spring of 1430. By this time, she was about 18 years old, still wearing armor, still carrying her banner, still insisting that God guided her steps. Yet the circumstances had shifted. She no longer led the great campaigns. Instead, she found herself involved in smaller sieges and raids. The contrast with the dramatic victories of the previous year was stark. In May 1430, Joan joined an effort to relieve the town of Compiègne, which was under threat from Burgundian forces. This would prove to be the fateful campaign that led to her downfall. As always, Joan believed victory was possible, if only the French acted with courage and faith. She rode with the defenders, urging them to resist and holding to her conviction that God's hand was still upon her. But the tides of war were shifting. The Burgundians were strong in the region, and the balance of power was not in Joan's favor. On May 23, 1430, during a skirmish outside Compiègne, Joan was pulled from her horse and captured by Burgundian soldiers. For the first time since her rise to prominence, she was no longer free to act. Her capture would set in motion the final chapter of her life, a chapter of imprisonment, trial, and execution. The months after Paris thus marked a decline in her influence, but not in her determination. She remained the same resolute figure, committed to her mission despite political obstacles. Yet forces beyond her control, royal caution, noble jealousy, and the strength of her enemies began to shape her fate. In the next segment, we will examine the circumstances of her capture at Compiègne in more detail, looking at how it happened, what it meant for France, and how it shifted the course of her extraordinary story. As we turn to May 1430, we arrive at the event that changed Joan of Arc's life forever, her capture outside the town of Compiègne. This moment marked the transition from her role as an active leader on the battlefield to that of a prisoner whose fate would be decided not by swords and banners, but by politics, betrayal, and trials. Compiègne was a strategically important town in northern France, situated on the Oise River. It was a key point of resistance against the Burgundians, who were allied with the English. For Charles VII, holding Compiègne was vital to maintaining his influence in the region. For Joan, it was another chance to prove that God's mission required continued bold action. She had not given up after the setback at Paris. She believed victory was still possible and that France would ultimately be liberated. In May 1430, Joan joined the defenders of Compiègne. Despite her declining influence at court, she remained committed to the fight, choosing to be where danger was greatest. On May 23, she led a small force in a sortie against the Burgundian besiegers. The plan was to strike quickly and then retreat back into the safety of the town's walls. At first, the attack went as expected. Joan and her companions rode out, clashing with Burgundian troops. But the tide turned when enemy reinforcements arrived. The French began to fall back toward the gates of Compiègne. As they retreated, the defenders on the walls panicked, fearing the enemy would pour into the city if they left the gates open too long. They closed them prematurely. Joan and several of her companions were left outside. In the chaos, Joan was pulled from her horse by a Burgundian archer. Accounts describe her fighting to the last, refusing to surrender easily, but she was overwhelmed and taken prisoner. For the Burgundians, this was a great triumph. They had captured the Maid of Orléans, the figure who had inspired French resistance and become a symbol of divine favor. For Joan, it was the end of her freedom and the beginning of a long ordeal. News of her capture spread quickly. To the French, it was a devastating blow. Soldiers and citizens alike felt despair, for they had believed Joan was protected by God. How could she fall into enemy hands? To the English and Burgundians, her capture was cause for celebration. They had not only removed a powerful symbol from the battlefield, but also gained the opportunity to discredit her. Joan's captors, the Burgundians, held her for several months. They were not inclined to release her, for they knew her value. She was too important a prisoner to be ransomed in the ordinary way. Instead, they negotiated with the English, who were eager to take custody of her. The English saw in Joan not only a dangerous enemy, but also a figure they could use for propaganda. If they could condemn her as a heretic or a witch, they could undermine the legitimacy she had given to Charles VII. By the end of 1430, Joan was sold to the English for a large sum of money. This transfer marked the beginning of her long imprisonment under English control. She was moved to Rouen, the English administrative center in northern France, where preparations began for her trial. The capture at Compiègne thus had consequences far beyond the battlefield. Militarily, it deprived the French of their most inspiring leader. Politically, it gave the English an opportunity to strike not with armies, but with words, laws, and accusations. Spiritually, it posed a challenge to Joan's followers, who had believed her divinely protected. For Joan herself, the capture was a test of her faith. She had always believed God would guide her mission. Now she faced months of isolation, interrogation, and uncertainty. Yet even in captivity, she refused to abandon her conviction that she was chosen by God. Her courage, which had carried her on the battlefield, would now carry her through the darkest phase of her life. The story of Compiègne also shows the brutal realities of medieval war. Gates closed too soon, allies unwilling to risk themselves, enemies eager to profit. All of these played a role. Joan's capture was not the result of a grand betrayal, but of the chaos of combat and the cold calculations of politics afterward. As we close this segment, Joan has been taken from the battlefield to a cell, her fate no longer in her own hands. The next stage of her story will not be fought with sword and banner, but with trials, accusations, and testimony. In the next segment, we will follow Joan through her imprisonment, examining how she was treated by her captors, how she responded, and how the English prepared to use her trial as a weapon in their larger struggle against France. After her capture at Compiègne and her sale to the English in late 1430, Joan of Arc entered a new and harsher chapter of her life. She was no longer the maid who rode freely with armies, carrying her banner into battle. Instead, she was a prisoner, confined within stone walls, watched constantly, and awaiting a trial that would decide her fate. For Joan, this period was one of isolation, fear, and endurance. For the English, it was an opportunity to destroy not just a girl, but the symbol she had become for France. Joan was taken to Rouen, the administrative center of English power in northern France. There, she was imprisoned in the castle of Bouvres. Unlike noble prisoners of war, who were often treated with courtesy and given relative freedom while awaiting ransom, Joan was treated harshly. She was locked in a cell, chained, and guarded by English soldiers. The choice to keep her under such conditions reflected her unique status. She was not seen as a noble enemy, but as a dangerous heretic, a woman whose very existence threatened English authority. The English knew Joan was more than a military leader. She was a living symbol of French resistance, and her capture offered them a chance to discredit her. If they could prove that her visions were false, that she was guilty of heresy or witchcraft, they could undermine the legitimacy she had given Charles VII. The coronation at Reims, which she had made possible, could be cast as invalid if the person who had brought it about was declared an agent of the devil. Her imprisonment was meant to break her spirit. She was held in chains, deprived of privacy, and constantly under guard. She had no access to her family, little comfort, and no opportunity to escape. Yet even under these harsh conditions, she remained steadfast. Those who encountered her later reported that she continued to pray, continued to express faith in her visions, and continued to declare that she was on God's mission. For the English, it was essential that her trial appear legitimate. They could not simply execute her out of hand. Instead, they turned to the machinery of the church. If Joan could be convicted of heresy by ecclesiastical authority, her condemnation would carry the weight of religious judgment. To arrange this, they turned to Pierre Cauchon, the Bishop of Beauvais, who was loyal to the English cause. Cauchon agreed to preside over the trial, lending it the appearance of a proper legal proceeding. The trial was delayed through the winter of 1430 and into the spring of 1431. During this time, Joan remained imprisoned, enduring long months of confinement. She faced repeated interrogations and was pressured to confess to wrongdoing. Yet she consistently insisted that her visions were true and that she was guided by God. Her strength of conviction, even in chains, impressed some of those who heard her. It is worth remembering that Joan was still only about 19 years old. She had risen from a peasant village to the heights of influence, and now she was trapped in a cold cell, facing the combined power of the English crown and the church authorities allied with it. Yet she did not waver. She spoke firmly, often turning the questions of her interrogators back on them. She maintained her composure, even when threatened with torture. The months of her imprisonment also reflected the different ways she was viewed. To the English soldiers guarding her, she was a hated enemy. They mocked her, jeered at her, and treated her roughly. To her supporters in France, who heard only fragments of news, she remained a figure of hope. Some still believed she would be rescued. Rumors circulated that God would intervene to free her. But no rescue came, and no intervention occurred. As the preparations for her trial neared completion, the English tightened their control. They knew that if she escaped, or if her influence grew again, it would undermine their efforts. Every detail of her custody was designed to keep her powerless. Yet within that powerlessness, Joan held on to the one thing she could control: her faith. The image of Joan in prison is stark, an armored maiden transformed into a chained prisoner. But it also reveals the consistency of her character. The courage that had led her to stand in battle with her banner now led her to face confinement with unshaken conviction. The trial that awaited her would be grueling, filled with hostile questions and dangerous traps. But Joan prepared herself in the only way she knew: through prayer, through steadfastness, and through her certainty that her voices had spoken the truth. The English thought they had removed her from the battlefield, but in the months of her imprisonment, they discovered that her influence was not so easily silenced. Her trial would be a battle of words and faith, one that would echo far beyond the walls of Rouen. In the next segment, we will enter the trial itself, examining how it was conducted, what questions were put to Joan, and how she responded under immense pressure from her interrogators. By early 1431, the stage was set for Joan of Arc's trial in Rouen. The English had secured her transfer from the Burgundians, installed her in the castle of Bouvray, and placed her under heavy guard. Now they intended to use the machinery of the church to discredit her. The trial was not only about Joan herself, it was about the legitimacy of Charles VII's coronation, the morale of the French people, and the broader struggle of the 100 Years' War. The trial officially opened on February 21st, 1431, in the Great Hall of the castle. Presiding over the proceedings was Bishop Pierre Cauchon of Beauvais, an ardent supporter of the English. He had long opposed the Dauphin Charles, and saw in Joan an opportunity to strike a blow against the French cause. Around him sat dozens of theologians, lawyers, and clerics, many drawn from the University of Paris, which supported English claims in France. The atmosphere was intimidating, designed to overwhelm a 19-year-old prisoner who had no formal education. From the beginning, the trial was stacked against Joan. She was denied legal counsel, an extraordinary denial even by the standards of the time. Instead, she faced a panel of hostile clerics who had already determined her guilt. Every detail of the trial was arranged to lead her into contradiction or confession. The charges ranged from heresy to witchcraft to disobedience to the church. Behind these accusations lay a clear goal: to prove that her visions were not divine, but diabolical, thereby undermining the authority she had given Charles VII. Joan, however, did not crumble under the weight of the court. When she was first brought before the judges, she showed composure and clarity. She asked for permission to attend Mass, which was denied. When asked to swear an oath to tell the truth on all matters, she agreed, but with a crucial condition. She said she would answer truthfully on matters relating to her trial, but reserved the right not to reveal everything her voices had told her. This careful distinction showed her sharpness of mind even in such a hostile setting. The early sessions focused on her identity, her visions, and her mission. She was questioned about her childhood in Domrémy, about the saints she claimed to have seen, and about the voices she heard. She named them as Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret. The judges pressed her for details, asking what they looked like, what language they spoke, and whether they had physical forms. Joan replied with caution. She described them as radiant and full of light, but refused to be trapped into describing them in ways that could be used against her. The judges also attacked her choice of clothing. Joan had worn male attire since setting out on her mission, both for practical protection on the road and as part of her identity as a soldier. To the court, however, this was a sign of transgression. The church strictly forbade cross-dressing, and Joan's persistence in wearing armor and male clothing was framed as disobedience to God. Joan defended herself calmly, saying she had done so at God's command and for safety among soldiers. Her response turned what was meant as a condemnation into a statement of obedience to her mission. The sessions were long and relentless. Over the weeks of February and March 1431, Joan was interrogated repeatedly, sometimes for hours at a time. The judges tried to confuse her, to catch her in contradictions, or to push her into statements that could be twisted as heretical. Yet again and again, she showed remarkable presence of mind. Though uneducated, she spoke with simplicity and conviction. She refused to deny her visions and held firm that she had acted under God's guidance. At times, her responses surprised her interrogators. When asked if she was in God's grace, a question designed as a trap, she answered, "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God keep me there." This response avoided the heresy of presumption while affirming her faith. The judges were frustrated by her ability to evade their traps, and some observers noted that she often outwitted the learned men questioning her. Despite her skillful defense, the trial was not a fair contest. The English and their allies were determined to convict her. They compiled dozens of articles of accusation, ranging from sorcery to blasphemy. The trial records, carefully preserved, reveal the intensity of the effort to condemn her. Yet they also reveal her resilience. Time and again, Joan insisted that she was guided by God and that her voices had never deceived her. The psychological pressure on Joan was immense. She was alone, chained, deprived of allies, and faced with hostile clerics day after day. Yet she did not falter. Those present noted her composure and her insistence on humility. She claimed no personal glory, saying instead that she was only God's servant. Even under interrogation, she maintained the same unshaken certainty that had carried her through the battles of Orléans and Patay. As the trial moved forward, the charges became sharper. The judges pressed her on the question of obedience, whether she would submit her visions to the judgment of the church. Joan replied that she would obey the church in all things, but she insisted that her voices came from God and could not be denied. This delicate balance frustrated her accusers, who wanted her either to submit fully to their authority or to defy it outright. Joan managed to do neither, standing instead on the simple ground of her faith. By March, the outlines of her fate were clear. The trial was designed not to discover truth, but to deliver a verdict. The English wanted her condemned, and Bishop Cauchon was prepared to see it through. Yet the proceedings also revealed Joan's strength. Instead of breaking her, the interrogations only demonstrated her courage and faith. In the next segment, we will look more closely at the continuation of the trial, focusing on the most dangerous accusations, heresy, witchcraft, and sorcery, and how Joan answered charges meant to paint her as an agent of the devil rather than a servant of God. As the trial of Joan of Arc progressed through the spring of 1431, the accusations against her sharpened. From the very beginning, Bishop Pierre Cauchon and the English authorities had aimed to prove that Joan's visions and actions were not divine, but diabolical. To discredit her, they needed to frame her as a heretic, a sorceress, or a witch. These were the most serious charges a person could face in the 15th century, carrying not only shame, but the sentence of death. The focus on heresy and witchcraft was deliberate. If Joan could be declared guilty of such crimes, then the coronation of Charles VII at Reims, which she had helped bring about, could be undermined. The English wanted the world to believe that Charles's kingship rested not on divine favor, but on deception. The attack on Joan was thus not simply personal but political, aimed at undoing the legitimacy she had secured for the French crown. The judges pressed Joan on the nature of her voices and visions. They asked repeatedly how she knew they came from God and not from demons. Joan replied simply and firmly that she recognized them by the peace and strength they brought her, and by the fact that they always directed her toward good and holy actions. She insisted that they had guided her to save France, to protect her virginity, and to honor God. For her, there was no doubt that they were from heaven. The judges attempted to trap her with theological questions. They asked whether she believed her salvation was guaranteed, whether she thought her voices could err, and whether she would submit her experiences to the authority of the Church. Each question carried danger. To claim certainty of salvation was considered heresy. To admit her voices could be false would undermine her mission. To refuse the authority of the Church would brand her as disobedient. Joan answered carefully, relying on humility and faith. She said she placed her hope in God, that her voices were from Him, and that she would submit to the Church so long as it did not command her to deny what God had revealed. Another line of attack concerned her clothing. The court returned often to the question of her wearing male attire. In the eyes of the Church, cross-dressing was forbidden under biblical law. For Joan, however, wearing armor and men's clothing had been a necessity on campaign. She explained that it protected her among soldiers and prevented assault. She also stated that her voices had instructed her to dress in this way. Her insistence that she wore such clothing by divine command turned the accusation into a declaration of obedience rather than disobedience. Yet the judges continued to circle back to this issue, recognizing that it was one of the more tangible charges they could make stick. The possibility of witchcraft was also raised. In the Middle Ages, accusations of witchcraft were often vague, based more on fear than evidence. The judges asked if she used spells, charms, or magical objects. Joan denied them all. She carried no talismans, only her banner and her sword, which she had taken from a church at Sainte Catherine de Fierbois. She insisted that her power came not from magic, but from God. Her victories, she said, were the result of faith, not sorcery. The interrogation sessions were intense, often lasting hours. Joan was young, uneducated, and chained, yet she faced a panel of learned men determined to break her. Observers later noted her composure under pressure, her ability to answer clearly without fear, and her refusal to betray her convictions. Her responses revealed a sharp intelligence and a deep sincerity. Still, the court controlled the record. The notaries wrote down her answers, but they could edit or interpret them as they wished. The English wanted her condemned, and the outcome of the trial was never truly in doubt. The process was designed to provide justification, not to reach a fair conclusion. During these weeks, Joan's isolation was nearly total. She was allowed no defense counsel and no outside support. Every person in the courtroom was aligned against her, yet she remained unbroken, returning again and again to the core of her faith. When asked how she could be sure her voices were real, she replied that she trusted God, that she had seen the results of obedience in victories on the battlefield, and that she would rather die than deny what she had experienced. Her interrogators tried to undermine her by pointing to her gender. They suggested that as a young woman, she had no place in warfare or politics. They accused her of stepping outside the natural order by leading men and commanding armies. Joan countered by insisting that she had been sent by God and that her actions had borne fruit in the liberation of France. She reminded them that biblical history included women who acted by divine command. Her answers, though simple, carried great weight because they drew on both scripture and her own lived experience. As the trial moved toward its climax, the judges compiled their case into a list of charges. These included claims that she had fabricated her visions, that she had engaged in superstitious practices, that she had worn men's clothing in defiance of God's law, and that she had placed her own authority above that of the church. Each charge was intended to strip away her credibility and present her as dangerous not only to the English, but to Christian society itself. Despite these attacks, Joan continued to project confidence in her mission. She declared that everything she had done was by God's command, and that if she had to face death for it, she was prepared. Her words carried the same conviction that had led her onto the battlefield, now redirected into the courtroom. The accusations of heresy and witchcraft were thus not just legal questions, but weapons of war. The English needed her condemned to weaken France, and the court was their instrument. Joan, chained and alone, resisted them with nothing but her faith and her voice. In the next segment, we will move into the later sessions of the trial, where Joan faced the final articles of accusation and was pressured to submit or face execution at the stake. By the spring of 1431, the trial of Joan of Arc had reached its final and most dangerous stage. Weeks of questioning had produced hundreds of pages of testimony, much of it carefully shaped by the notaries to favor the prosecution. Now Bishop Pierre Cauchon and the tribunal distilled these into formal charges known as the Articles of Accusation. These articles would determine her fate, and Joan faced the full weight of the English-backed church court pressing for her condemnation. The articles ran to more than 70 in total, though they were later reduced for clarity. They covered every aspect of her life and mission, from her visions and voices to her clothing and her obedience to the church. Each article was framed to portray her actions as heretical, rebellious, or dangerous. She was accused of lying about her visions, of placing her personal revelations above the authority of the church, of disobeying divine law by dressing as a man, of engaging in superstitious practices, and of supporting a false king through her influence at Reims. At the heart of the charges lay the question of authority. The judges argued that the church held ultimate authority on matters of faith, and that Joan, by refusing to submit fully to their judgment, was guilty of defiance. Joan responded that she respected the church, but she insisted that her voices came from God and that she could not deny them. To obey the judges instead of the voices, she said, would be to disobey God. This defense showed both her devotion and the central tension of the trial, her conviction against their authority. The judges pressed her repeatedly to admit that her visions might be false or deceptive. Joan refused. She declared that she was more certain of her voices than she was of her own life. When asked whether she would renounce them if the church commanded, she said she would obey the church in all lawful things, but could not deny what God had revealed. This answer frustrated her accusers, who wanted a clear submission or a clear refusal. Joan gave them neither, instead holding to a narrow line of faith that could not be shaken. Her clothing returned again as a focus of attack. The court insisted that her wearing of male attire was unnatural and sinful. Joan repeated her explanation. She wore it for protection in the company of soldiers, to safeguard her chastity, and because her voices had directed her to do so. She stated plainly that she would not abandon it without God's permission. To her judges, this was evidence of stubbornness and disobedience. To Joan, it was obedience to her mission. The trial's final interrogations were held not in the grand public hall, but in smaller, more private sessions. Here the judges tried to pressure Joan into submission through intimidation and threats. They warned her of execution, reminded her of the fire, and sought to terrify her into recanting. Joan showed fear, as any 19-year-old would, but she did not betray her core convictions. When asked whether she feared being burned, she replied that she trusted her fate to God, but that she wished to preserve her soul. On April 18, 1431, the tribunal presented Joan with the official list of articles against her. It was a daunting document, filled with accusations of heresy and error. Joan was given the chance to respond, but the charges were framed in such a way that any answer could be used against her. If she denied them, she was accused of stubbornness. If she admitted them, she was condemned by her own words. It was, in truth, a no-win situation. The final articles accused her of 4 main errors: believing her voices without church approval, wearing men's clothing against divine law, placing her personal revelations above obedience to the church, and persisting in these errors despite repeated warnings. These were sufficient grounds for conviction under canon law, and the tribunal moved steadily toward that end. The climax of these interrogations came when Joan was shown the instruments of torture. She was told that if she did not confess, she could be subjected to pain to force her to speak. Medieval courts sometimes used torture to extract confessions, though in Joan's case, it was not actually applied. She was brought to the chamber and confronted with the devices, but stood firm. She declared that even if her body were torn apart, she would not deny her voices, for they came from God. The threat failed to break her, and the judges returned to verbal pressure. Through these final interrogations, Joan revealed both her humanity and her extraordinary strength. She admitted fear. She hesitated at times, but she never abandoned her core belief that she had been sent by God to save France. Her answers, often simple, carried immense weight. She did not argue theology at length, but returned again and again to her lived experience. She had heard the voices, she had obeyed them, and the results had been victories for France and the coronation of the king. By late April, the court was ready to move to sentencing. The articles of accusation had been prepared, her answers recorded, and the conclusion predetermined. Yet one more step remained. The tribunal planned a public session to read the charges, to display her supposed errors, and to pressure her into recanting before an audience. If she recanted, she could be spared immediate death, though at the cost of admitting her mission was false. If she refused, she would face execution as a heretic. The English had waited many months for this moment. They had not fought to capture Joan, only to let her go free. They needed her condemned to discredit Charles VII and weaken the French. Bishop Cauchon and the court were prepared to deliver that outcome, but they wanted her words, her submission, or her defiance to justify it. The trial had begun with her capture and imprisonment, had passed through weeks of questioning, and now approached its conclusion. Joan, still chained, still 19, faced the final choice: deny her mission or face the fire. In the next segment, we will witness the closing phase of the trial, when Joan stood before the public, heard the formal charges against her, and faced the agonizing decision of whether to abjure her voices or remain faithful to them unto death. By May 1431, Joan of Arc's long and grueling trial had reached its decisive moment. After months of interrogation, threats, and accusations, the judges brought her before a large public gathering to deliver their final pressure. The event took place in the cemetery of Saint Ouen in Rouen, a setting chosen deliberately. It was open, visible to the crowd, and infused with the solemnity of judgment. The goal was not only to condemn Joan, but to make an example of her, to break her publicly so that her supporters would see her mission as false. On May 24, Joan was led out of her cell and placed on a platform in front of church officials, English authorities, and a large assembly of citizens. She was dressed in her usual male clothing, the very thing that had become one of the charges against her. Beside her stood the theologians and judges who had questioned her for months. Bishop Pierre Cochon presided, ready to read the articles of accusation. The charges were lengthy and damning. Joan was accused of heresy, witchcraft, disobedience to the church, and persistence in wearing men's clothing. She was accused of fabricating visions and of leading people astray. Each article was read aloud, and each one painted her as a danger not only to the English, but to the entire Christian faith. The atmosphere was heavy, with the crowd waiting to hear how Joan would respond. The judges then turned to Joan and demanded her submission. They told her plainly that unless she abjured, unless she recanted her visions, admitted her errors, and submitted completely to the church, she would be condemned as a heretic and burned at the stake. The pressure was immense. Joan, 19 years old, already weakened by months of captivity, stood before a crowd that wanted to see an outcome. Behind the church officials stood the English soldiers, eager for her death. At first, Joan resisted. She declared once again that her voices were from God, that she could not deny them, and that all she had done was at divine command. But as the moment stretched on, the threats of immediate execution weighed heavily on her. The judges made it clear she would be burned alive if she did not yield. The instruments of death were near, and the fear of the fire became overwhelming. Under this terrible pressure, Joan faltered. At last, she signed a brief statement of abjuration. The wording was not long, but it carried devastating meaning. She renounced the authority of her visions, promised obedience to the church, and agreed to abandon her male clothing. Her mark was placed on the document, likely a simple cross, since she could not write her name. The judges seized upon this as a triumph. In their eyes, Joan had confessed her error and yielded to their authority. The immediate sentence was not death, but life imprisonment. Joan was told she would be confined in a church prison, where she would live in penance for her sins. The crowd saw this as her defeat. The English saw it as a momentary victory, though they had hoped for more. Joan's abjuration had stripped away her aura of divine mission, at least in the eyes of her enemies. Yet the moment was not so simple. Joan herself was devastated by what she had done. She had acted under the unbearable fear of the stake, but almost immediately she regretted it. In private, she wept and confessed that she had betrayed her voices. To her, the abjuration was a failure of courage, a moment when fear had overcome faith. Her strength, so unshakable in battle and interrogation, had finally cracked under the threat of the fire. The aftermath revealed further cruelty. Instead of transferring Joan to an ecclesiastical prison under the supervision of nuns, as had been promised, she was returned to her English jailers. There, she was kept in the same conditions as before, chained, guarded by soldiers, deprived of privacy. Her clothing, too, became an issue again. After some days, Joan resumed wearing male attire. The reasons are debated. Some accounts say her guards left her no choice, removing her female clothing and forcing her to put on men's garments. Others suggest she chose to return to them as a sign of rejecting her abjuration. Whatever the details, the court seized on it as proof that she had relapsed into heresy. This relapse gave her judges the justification they needed. In canon law, a person who recanted but then returned to the same error was considered a relapsed heretic, for whom the penalty was death. Bishop Cochon and the English authorities moved quickly to use this against her. Within days, they prepared to condemn her finally and irrevocably. The scene at St. Ounin had been meant to humiliate and break Joan before a watching crowd. In the short term, it seemed to succeed, but in the longer view, it revealed her humanity. Even a figure of such courage could falter under the threat of the fire. Her abjuration did not erase her faith, and her return to her earlier stance soon after showed that her conviction remained. As we close this segment, Joan stands condemned as a relapsed heretic, her fate sealed by the technicality of clothing and the relentless determination of her judges. The English had achieved their goal. She would be executed, and they hoped her death would destroy her legacy. In the next segment, we will move to the final stage of Joan's life, her condemnation to death, and her execution in Rouen's marketplace, an event witnessed by thousands and remembered for centuries. By late May 1431, the outcome of Joan of Arc's trial was settled. After her brief abjuration at Saint-Ouen, her return to male attire gave the court exactly what it needed to declare her a relapsed heretic. In the eyes of canon law, relapse was unforgivable. Once a person had confessed error and then fallen back into it, execution was inevitable. Bishop Pierre Cauchon and the English authorities moved quickly to finalize her condemnation. On May 29th, Joan was brought again before the court. The decision was read aloud. She was guilty of relapse, heresy, and stubbornness. The punishment was death by burning, the standard penalty for heresy. Joan was 19 years old. For months she had faced interrogation, threats, and isolation, and now she faced the most feared death of her time. The next morning, May 30, Joan was led from her prison in the castle of Rouen to the marketplace where the execution would take place. The English authorities wanted the event to be public, witnessed by thousands, so that her death could serve as a warning and a spectacle. Soldiers lined the streets to prevent any attempt at rescue, though in truth, no such attempt was likely. The French loyal to Charles VII had no power in Rouen, and Joan was firmly in English hands. She was dressed in a simple robe and placed on a cart. Witnesses described her as pale but calm. She asked for a cross to hold as she went to her death. One sympathetic Englishman, moved by her courage, made a small cross from wood and handed it to her. She pressed it to her chest as she was carried to the scaffold. She also requested that a larger crucifix be held before her, so she could gaze upon it in her final moments. The marketplace in Rouen was crowded with spectators, townspeople, clerics, soldiers, and officials. Some came out of curiosity, others to see justice done, as defined by the English, and still others to mourn. The platform for her execution had been constructed high so that all could see. At its center stood the stake, with wood piled around it to form the pyre. Before the fire was lit, Joan spoke. She declared once more that she had been sent by God and that her voices had guided her. She asked forgiveness for any sins and called upon Christ. Her words were not defiant, but prayerful, a final affirmation of the faith that had carried her from Domrémy to Rouen. Witnesses reported that many in the crowd were moved to tears by her composure. Even some English soldiers, hardened by years of war, were said to have wept. As the executioners bound her to the stake and prepared the fire, Joan clutched the cross she had been given. A Dominican friar stood near her, holding up the larger crucifix so she could see it clearly. She cried out the name of Jesus repeatedly. As the flames rose, the smoke and fire engulfed her, and within minutes her life ended. The crowd watched in silence and sorrow. For all the efforts of the English and Bishop Cauchon to frame the execution as justice, the manner of her death made a deep impression. She did not curse her captors, she did not renounce her mission, and she did not waver in faith. She died with prayers on her lips, and many who saw it believed they had witnessed the death of a holy woman. After the fire had done its work, the English ordered that her ashes be gathered and cast into the Seine River. This was done deliberately, to prevent any relics from being preserved. They feared that if her bones or clothing were kept, they would become objects of veneration. By scattering her remains in the river, they hoped to erase her memory. But memory is not so easily erased. News of her execution spread quickly. In France, it provoked grief and outrage. Many could not understand how the maiden who had saved Orléans and brought about the coronation at Reims could have been allowed to perish in flames. For Charles VII, her death was a painful loss, though he did little to prevent it at the time. For the English, her execution removed a symbol of French resistance, yet it also planted the seeds of her enduring legend. In the immediate aftermath, Rouen remained quiet, but among those who had witnessed the event, the impression was lasting. Some said they saw the name of Jesus form in the flames. Others said a white dove flew upward as she died. Whether these were facts or the shaping of memory, they reflected the deep impact of the moment. Joan's execution was meant to destroy her reputation. Instead, it secured her place in history. The English had killed her body, but her image as the Maid of Orléans, faithful to God even unto death, could not be destroyed by fire or water. In time, her death would come to be seen not as the punishment of a heretic, but as the martyrdom of a saint. As we end this segment, Joan's life has reached its tragic close in the marketplace of Rouen. Yet her story did not end there. In the decades that followed, her memory would grow, her reputation would be reassessed, and eventually, her name would be cleared. In the next segment, we will explore the aftermath of her execution, how France reacted, how Charles VII responded, and how Joan's image began to shift from condemned heretic to national heroine. When the flames consumed Joan of Arc in Rouen's marketplace on May 30, 1431, her earthly life ended, but her story did not. The immediate aftermath of her execution set in motion a chain of reactions that shaped how she was remembered, how France carried on the war, and how her legacy evolved from condemned heretic to celebrated heroine. The English and their allies had intended the execution to serve as a warning. By condemning Joan as a heretic, they hoped to discredit Charles VII and break the spirit of the French people. They wanted her death to show that the Maid of Orléans had been nothing more than a fraud, a dangerous figure misled by demons. Yet the effect was not what they expected. In Rouen itself, the execution left a deep impression. Many citizens of the city had witnessed Joan's trial and death. They had seen her stand calmly at the stake, calling out to Jesus, asking for a cross, and praying until her final breath. Far from appearing as a heretic, she seemed to many like a martyr. Chroniclers noted that even hardened English soldiers were shaken by the sight, with some reportedly declaring that the French had killed a saint. Such testimony, though whispered at first, spread quickly. The French reaction was one of grief and outrage. News of her death reached Charles VII and his supporters, who mourned the loss of the young woman who had transformed the course of the war. Yet Charles did not attempt to rescue Joan while she lived, nor did he intervene during her trial. Historians have debated his silence, some suggesting political caution, others pointing to the difficulty of acting in English-controlled territory. Whatever the reason, Joan's execution left him with a complicated legacy. He owed his crown to her, yet he had not saved her from the fire. In the years immediately following her death, the war continued. The English still held Paris and much of northern France, but the tide of the 100 Years' War slowly shifted. Charles VII consolidated his position, built alliances, and reformed his army. In 1435, the Treaty of Arras brought Burgundy back into alliance with the French, depriving the English of their most important continental partner. By the 1440s, French forces had regained strength, and by 1453, the English had been driven from nearly all of France except Calais. As France recovered, Joan's memory grew stronger. Though condemned in 1431, She was remembered by soldiers and citizens as the maiden who had turned the war. Own stories of Orléans, Patay, and Reims circulated widely, keeping her image alive. Among common people, she was honored not as a heretic, but as a heroine. Her death at the stake was interpreted as martyrdom, not justice. Even within the church, doubts about her trial began to surface. Many clerics questioned the fairness of the proceedings, noting that she had been denied legal counsel and kept in an English prison instead of a church one. Some saw her abjuration and relapse as forced by circumstance rather than true confession. Over time, the idea that she had been wrongly condemned gained ground. By the 1450s, with the war nearing its end and France restored under Charles VII, the question of Joan's trial returned. In 1450, Charles ordered an investigation into the circumstances of her condemnation. Witnesses were called, records examined, and doubts voiced. This inquiry laid the groundwork for a fuller reconsideration of her case. In 1455, a formal retrial was opened at the request of Joan's family, supported by Charles VII. This was known as the nullification trial or rehabilitation trial. It aimed not only to clear her name, but to correct the injustice that had been done. Over the next several years, dozens of witnesses testified, including many who had known Joan personally or observed her trial in Rouen. They spoke of her piety, her courage, and the unfairness of the original proceedings. In 1456, the Church issued its verdict. The trial of 1431 was declared invalid, corrupt, and unjust. The judgment was nullified, and Joan was declared innocent. She was recognized as a true Christian who had been condemned wrongly by a biased court serving political ends. For her family, this was vindication. For Charles VII, it was a posthumous confirmation of the woman who had crowned him. For France, it was the restoration of a national heroine. Joan's rehabilitation came 25 years after her death, but it ensured that her memory would endure not as that of a heretic, but as that of a martyr. Her story became part of the national identity of France, a symbol of resistance, faith, and courage in the face of overwhelming odds. The English had sought to erase her by scattering her ashes in the Seine, but they could not erase the memory of her life. The people who had seen her in battle, who had followed her to Reims, and who had witnessed her death, passed on their stories. These accounts, combined with the formal reversal of her condemnation, transformed Joan from prisoner to legend. As we move forward in her story, the immediate aftermath of her execution fades into the broader question of her legacy. How was she remembered in France in the generations after her death? How did her image evolve from local heroine to international symbol and eventually to sainthood? In the next segment, we will trace the long arc of Joan's memory, from her rehabilitation in the 15th century to her growing stature as a national icon in France during the centuries that followed. With Joan of Arc's execution in 1431, her captors believed they had silenced her forever. Yet in truth, her death became the beginning of a legend. The decades following her martyrdom transformed her from a condemned heretic into a vindicated figure, and in time, into a symbol of France itself. The first step in this transformation was the official rehabilitation trial of 1455 to 1456. This process was initiated at the request of Joan's family. Her mother, Isabelle Romay, and her brothers, who petitioned the papacy to clear her name. Their plea was supported by Charles VII, the very king whom Joan had helped crown at Reims. For Charles, there was much at stake. By 1455, France had turned the tide of the 100 Years' War, and English power was in decline. To erase the stain of heresy from the woman who had legitimized his kingship was politically useful as well as morally necessary. The retrial was conducted with far greater fairness than the original. Over 100 witnesses were called, ranging from childhood neighbors in Domrémy to soldiers who had fought alongside her, clerics who had interacted with her, and even individuals who had observed her condemnation in Rouen. Their testimony painted a strikingly different picture from the one presented in 1431. Instead of a dangerous heretic, Joan emerged as a devout young woman of extraordinary piety, courage, and integrity. Neighbors from Domrémy spoke of her childhood faith, her hours of prayer, and her reputation for honesty. Soldiers described her leadership, her refusal to tolerate swearing or looting, and her inspiring presence on the battlefield. Clerics acknowledged her humility and her constant insistence that she acted as a servant of God, not for her own glory. Even some who had participated in the original trial admitted that it had been manipulated by political motives. On July 7, 1456, the final verdict was delivered in Paris. The court declared the 1431 trial null and void, branding it as unjust, corrupt, and motivated by political bias. Joan was declared innocent of heresy, and her reputation was officially restored. A public ceremony followed, during which her family was present to hear her name cleared. For Isabelle Romée, who had fought tirelessly for this moment, it was a vindication of her daughter's honor. For France, it marked the reclaiming of one of its most inspiring figures. The rehabilitation trial ensured that Joan would be remembered not as a condemned criminal, but as a martyr wrongfully executed. From that point forward, her memory grew. In the later 15th century and beyond, chroniclers began to tell her story with admiration. She was remembered as La Pucelle d'Orléans, the Maid of Orléans, the girl who had saved France at its darkest hour. Her reputation also benefited from the eventual French victory in the 100 Years' War. By 1453, the war was effectively over, with the English driven from nearly all of France. Joan's role in turning the tide, lifting the siege of Orléans, securing the coronation of Charles VII, and inspiring the French people, was seen as pivotal. Without her, it was believed, France might have been lost. Her legend grew as part of the story of national triumph. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Joan's memory persisted. Though not always at the forefront, France faced new conflicts, including the wars of religion, which divided Catholics and Protestants. Each side sometimes claimed Joan as their own. Catholics admired her devotion and martyrdom, while some Protestants viewed her as a patriotic symbol apart from church authority. Across these divisions, she remained a figure of courage and sacrifice. By the 18th century, her story had entered popular imagination more widely. Writers, poets, and historians retold her life, often romanticizing her rise from peasant girl to military leader. In the Age of Enlightenment, she was sometimes criticized by skeptics who doubted her visions, but even then, she was acknowledged as a remarkable figure who had changed the course of history. Voltaire, for example, mocked her in one of his works, yet the fact that he wrote about her at all shows how deeply her story had endured. The 19th century marked a revival of Joan's legend on a grand scale. In the aftermath of the French Revolution and the rise of nationalism, she became an emblem of the French spirit. Artists painted her, writers celebrated her, and politicians invoked her memory. The French people, searching for symbols of unity in a divided age, turned to the Maid of Orléans as a reminder of courage, sacrifice, and devotion to the nation. This period also saw the beginning of formal efforts to move Joan toward sainthood. The Catholic Church, which had once condemned her, now increasingly recognized her as a figure of holiness. Her life of purity, her devotion to God, and her martyrdom made her a natural candidate. Devotion to her grew, particularly in Domrémy, Orléans, and Rouen, where local pilgrimages and commemorations took place. By the late 19th century, the Church had opened the process of her canonization. In 1909, she was beatified, a step towards sainthood. This recognition acknowledged not only her personal holiness, but also the injustice of her trial and execution. It also reflected her enduring popularity among the faithful, who saw her as a model of courage and devotion. As her legend grew, Joan came to embody both religious and national ideals. She was remembered as a servant of God and a savior of France. She represented faith, courage, purity, and sacrifice, qualities that transcended the centuries and resonated with people in times of struggle. The rehabilitation of 1456 had restored her name. The centuries that followed turned her into a legend. By the time of her beatification in the early 20th century, Joan of Arc was no longer just a figure of history. She was an icon of faith and patriotism, revered far beyond the fields of Domrémy or the walls of Orléans. In the next segment, we will follow Joan's journey from beatification to sainthood, examining how the Catholic Church canonized her in 1920, and how her image became not only a symbol for France, but for the wider world. By the close of the 19th century, Joan of Arc's reputation had risen far beyond the rehabilitation verdict of 1456. For centuries, she had been remembered as a heroine of France and a martyr of faith. Now, the Catholic Church began the process of raising her officially to the ranks of the saints. This journey from national symbol to canonized saint was long, careful, and deeply significant, both for France and for the wider Catholic world. The path to sainthood in the Catholic Church is rigorous. It begins with recognition of heroic virtue and moves through stages of beatification and canonization. For Joan, the initial steps were propelled by the devotion of the faithful and the persistence of French clerics, who saw her as more than a historical figure. Her life of chastity, courage, and obedience to God's call, along with her unjust martyrdom, made her an obvious candidate. In 1869, formal steps toward her canonization began when Bishop Félix Dupanloup of Orléans petitioned the Vatican to consider her case. His request reflected not only religious devotion, but also the growing national veneration of Joan in France. By this time, she had become a symbol of unity, courage, and identity, especially after the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871, when France again found itself defeated and humiliated. In those dark years, the memory of Joan inspired renewed calls for her recognition by the Church. The investigation into her life and virtues was thorough. Church officials examined the trial records from 1431, the rehabilitation documents of 1456, and centuries of testimony regarding her holiness. They considered her virginity, her devotion to prayer, her willingness to suffer, and her steadfastness under interrogation and death. Witnesses from history spoke through written records, and the consistency of her character across centuries of accounts strengthened the case. In 1909, Joan was beatified by Pope Pius X in a solemn ceremony at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Beatification recognized her as blessed, permitting local veneration and acknowledging her as a model of holiness. For the French people, it was a moment of profound significance. The woman once condemned as a heretic by a church court was now lifted up by the same church as a figure of sanctity. The beatification drew wide attention, not only in France but internationally. Pilgrimages to Domrémy, Orléans, and Rouen increased as the faithful sought to honor the maid who had been vindicated. French soldiers in particular looked to her as a patroness, a heavenly protector who had once stood on the battlefield and who now interceded for them in prayer. The final step came in 1920, when Pope Benedict XV canonized Joan of Arc as a saint of the Catholic Church. The ceremony, held on May 16th, declared her Saint Joan of Arc, placing her among the recognized saints of history. The timing was powerful. The First World War had just ended, a conflict that had devastated France. During the war, Joan's image had been invoked repeatedly as a symbol of courage and national defense. Soldiers carried her image into battle, and her story was retold as an example of steadfastness in the face of overwhelming odds. Her canonization was thus both a religious and a national event. For Catholics, it affirmed her holiness and her martyrdom. For the French, it confirmed her as the eternal symbol of their nation's resilience. In the aftermath of the war, when the country was grieving its losses and searching for unity, the canonization of Joan of Arc brought renewed strength. With sainthood, Joan's image expanded beyond France. She became a universal figure of faith and courage, admired by people across the world. In the Catholic Church, she was recognized as a patron saint of soldiers and of France. Her feast day was set as May 30, the anniversary of her execution. Devotions in her honor spread not only in Europe, but in the Americas and beyond. Artists, writers, and filmmakers seized upon her story with new energy in the 20th century. Paintings, statues, plays, and later films portrayed her as both saint and warrior. She appeared in churches, town squares, and cultural works as a symbol of purity, bravery, and sacrifice. Each retelling emphasized different aspects. Some focused on her military leadership, others on her mystical visions, still others on her martyrdom. Yet all agreed on her extraordinary significance. Canonization also brought theological reflection. Joan was not a mystic who retreated from the world into prayer alone. She was a figure of action who took her visions into the field and changed the course of history. Her sainthood affirmed that holiness could take many forms, including the leadership of armies and the defense of a nation. This recognition broadened the Church's understanding of sanctity, showing that a young peasant woman, without education or status, could achieve sainthood through obedience, courage, and faith. From beatification in 1909 to canonization in 1920, Joan of Arc's journey was complete in the eyes of the Church. She had been condemned in life, vindicated in death, rehabilitated in history, and finally raised to sainthood. Her image, once used by the English to discredit France, was now embraced by the world as a beacon of faith and courage. In the next segment, we will explore how Joan of Arc's legacy developed in the modern era, how she became not only a saint but a symbol of identity, invoked by different movements from nationalists to feminists, and how her story continues to resonate in diverse contexts today. With Joan of Arc's canonization in 1920, her story entered a new phase, no longer confined to the medieval battlefield or the Church's history. Her image became a powerful symbol across the modern world. In France, she was embraced as both saint and national heroine. Beyond France, she was admired as a figure of faith, courage, and sacrifice. In the 20th century, her story was reinterpreted and invoked by many different groups, each finding in her life qualities that spoke to their own struggles and hopes. In France, Joan quickly became a unifying national icon. After the devastation of the First World War, her canonization offered a moment of pride and healing. Her feast day, May 30, was established as a national holiday in France. Parades, processions, and ceremonies honored her memory, particularly in Orléans, where the lifting of the siege was celebrated each year. In a country divided by political and cultural tensions, Joan stood as a shared figure of identity. She symbolized resilience, sacrifice, and loyalty to France above all. Politicians also used her image. During the 1920s and 1930s, both conservative and progressive movements claimed her as their own. To conservatives, she represented loyalty to tradition, Catholic faith, and national defense. To Republicans and secularists, she was seen as a defender of the people, a figure who rose from humble origins to challenge powerful elites. Her story was flexible enough to be invoked by all sides, making her a contested but unifying symbol in French politics. During the Second World War, Joan's legacy was again prominent. Both the Free French forces under Charles de Gaulle and the Vichy regime under Marshal Pétain invoked her memory. To de Gaulle, she represented resistance, the spirit of France refusing to yield to foreign occupation. To Pétain, she symbolized Catholic tradition and the protection of the homeland. The fact that both sides claimed her demonstrated her enduring power as a national emblem. Beyond politics, Joan also became an inspiration for movements seeking to highlight women's courage and leadership. In the 19th and 20th centuries, feminists began to celebrate her as a pioneer, a woman who defied the strict gender roles of her time to take command of armies and shape the destiny of a nation. Her cross-dressing, once condemned, was reinterpreted as a form of liberation from traditional constraints. Writers and activists pointed to her as an example of how women could lead, inspire, and change history. In the arts, Joan's story flourished. Playwrights, poets, and novelists retold her life in countless ways. George Bernard Shaw's play St. Joan, first performed in 1923, presented her as a strong, independent thinker, a woman ahead of her time. The play emphasized her conviction and her clash with the institutions that condemned her. In cinema, directors brought her story to the screen in powerful portrayals, such as Carl Theodor Dreyer's silent film The Passion of Joan of Arc in 1928, which remains one of the most celebrated films in history for its stark and emotional depiction of her trial and execution. Artists also embraced her image. Painters depicted her visions, her battles, and her death, often blending historical detail with symbolic meaning. Sculptors created monuments in towns and cities across France, placing her on horseback, banner in hand, as the eternal warrior saint. In churches, stained glass windows and statues portrayed her kneeling in prayer or standing in armor. Her presence spread far beyond Orléans and Domrémy, becoming familiar across Europe and the wider world. The Catholic Church deepened its devotion to her as well. Joan became the patron saint of France and was invoked as a protector of soldiers, particularly during the turbulent decades of the 20th century. Devotions in her honor spread to Catholic communities in North America, South America, and Asia. Her feast day was marked by liturgies, prayers, and processions. Her appeal also crossed religious and cultural lines. Protestants, though outside the Catholic tradition of saints, admired her as a figure of faith and conviction. Secular admirers valued her courage, patriotism, and humanity. Even skeptics of religion recognized her as a historical figure of extraordinary determination. She became not only a saint for the faithful, but a universal symbol of standing firm against overwhelming odds. In modern times, Joan's story continues to inspire. She is invoked in discussions of national identity, women's leadership, resistance against oppression, and the courage to follow one's convictions. Her image appears in literature, film, music, and even popular culture, adapted in countless forms, but always recognizable. The young peasant girl from Domrémy, who claimed to hear voices and led armies to victory, has never lost her power to move hearts and minds. The 20th century transformed Joan from a figure of French history into a global icon, yet at the heart of her legacy remains the same story, a teenager of humble origins, who believed she was called by God, who rose to a role no one expected, who inspired a nation, and who faced death with unwavering faith. In the next segment, we will explore how historians and scholars have studied Joan of Arc, how her visions, her leadership, and her trial have been interpreted across the centuries, and how debates about her continue to shape our understanding of her life today. As Joan of Arc's legend grew across centuries, scholars and historians turned to her life with questions that remain alive today. Who was Joan? How should her voices be understood? What role did she truly play in military strategy? And how do we reconcile the peasant girl of Domrémy with the commander who altered the course of the 100 Years' War? Interpretations of Joan have shifted with the times, reflecting not only new evidence, but also the concerns of each generation that studied her. The earliest interpretations came from contemporaries who had witnessed her directly. Chroniclers of the 15th century often emphasized the miraculous. French writers saw her as a gift from God, the maiden prophesied to save France. English writers, by contrast, painted her as a witch or sorceress, an agent of the devil whose defeat was necessary for their cause. These early accounts were not neutral history, but propaganda, shaped by the politics of the war. With the rehabilitation trial of 1456, a new perspective took shape. Testimonies from those who had known Joan emphasized her piety, humility, and honesty. These accounts, collected into official records, provided historians with rich detail about her life in Domrémy, her visions, and her actions in battle. They created the foundation for much of what we know about her today. In later centuries, interpretations began to vary. Enlightenment writers of the 18th century, skeptical of miracles, tended to downplay the supernatural elements of Joan's story. Voltaire, in his satirical poem La Pucelle d'Orléans, mocked her visions and presented her tale with irreverence. Yet even he acknowledged her historical impact, a sign that her memory could not be dismissed. The 19th century brought a revival of romantic interest in Joan. Historians and writers, influenced by nationalism, saw her as a symbol of France itself. Jules Michelet, a prominent French historian, described her as the very embodiment of the French spirit, pure, courageous, and selfless. For Michelet, Joan was not merely a religious figure, but the personification of the people rising to defend their land. This interpretation resonated deeply in a century when national identity was increasingly important. Military historians have long debated Joan's actual role in strategy. Some argue that she was primarily a symbol, inspiring troops but leaving tactical decisions to experienced commanders. Others suggest she had a more active role, urging bold action when cautious generals hesitated. The evidence shows that while Joan did not design complex strategies, her insistence on immediate attack and her presence in the thick of battle often tipped the balance. Her influence was less about technical command and more about morale and determination. The question of her voices has been central to many interpretations. Believers see them as genuine divine revelations, consistent with her sanctity and her later canonization. Skeptical historians have proposed psychological or medical explanations, suggesting she may have experienced auditory hallucinations or epileptic seizures. Others interpret her visions as expressions of deep faith shaped by the culture of her time, in which saints and angels were vivid realities for devout Christians. Regardless of explanation, the fact remains that Joan believed in them fully and acted with unwavering confidence in their guidance. Feminist scholars have also engaged with Joan's story. They highlight her defiance of gender norms, wearing male clothing, leading men into battle, and speaking with authority in a world that rarely allowed women such roles. Some see her as an early example of female agency and leadership, a figure who transcended the limitations placed upon her by society. Her trial, in this interpretation, becomes not only a political act, but also an attempt to suppress a woman who had stepped beyond her assigned place. Religious historians, meanwhile, continue to reflect on her sainthood. They see in her life a profound example of obedience to conscience, of trust in God even in the face of death. Her trial testimony, preserved in detail, reveals a depth of faith and clarity of thought that has inspired theologians as much as historians. Modern scholarship often emphasizes the complexity of Joan. She was at once a mystic and a soldier, a peasant and a political figure, a teenager and a saint. She cannot be reduced to a single role. Instead, she represents the intersection of faith, politics, gender, and war in medieval Europe. This complexity is part of why she continues to fascinate. Today, historians approach Joan with both critical analysis and respect for her extraordinary impact. They examine the records of her trial, the testimonies of her rehabilitation, and the chronicles of her time. They compare interpretations across centuries, noting how each age finds in Joan something of its own concerns. Some focus on the social context of Domrémy, exploring how her rural upbringing shaped her. Others study the political divisions of France, showing how her mission fit into the broader struggle of Armagnacs and Burgundians. Still others analyze her symbolism, tracing how she has been invoked in art, politics, and religion across 600 years. What emerges from all these interpretations is not a single definitive answer, but a recognition of her enduring significance. Whether seen as saint, soldier, mystic, or national heroine, Joan of Arc remains one of the most extraordinary figures of history, someone who rose from obscurity, followed her convictions, and left an imprint that no amount of fire could erase. In the next segment, we will look more closely at Joan's enduring image in culture and art, how painters, poets, musicians, and filmmakers have reimagined her across centuries, and how each medium has contributed to the legend of the Maid of Orléans. Joan of Arc's story has not remained confined to chronicles and court records. Across the centuries, her life has been retold and reimagined in art, literature, music, and film. Each generation of creators has found something in her story that spoke to its own concerns. As a result, Joan has become one of the most represented figures in Western culture, her image shifting with time, but never fading. The first artistic responses to Joan's life emerged not long after her death. In 15th century France, poems and songs celebrated the Maid of Orléans as a savior of the kingdom. Ballads praised her courage and lamented her martyrdom, ensuring that her memory lived on in popular culture even before her rehabilitation in 1456. Illuminated manuscripts occasionally depicted her with a banner, a sign that she was already seen as a heroic figure. The Renaissance and Baroque eras brought less attention to Joan, but she was never entirely forgotten. Local commemorations in Orléans kept her story alive, particularly through annual festivals marking the lifting of the siege. These celebrations, blending civic pride with devotion, became traditions that still continue today. It was in the Romantic era of the 19th century that Joan's image flourished once more. Nationalism was rising across Europe, and France, still wrestling with the legacy of the Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, looked to its past for symbols of unity. Joan fit this need perfectly. Writers and artists presented her as the embodiment of the French spirit, pure, selfless, and devoted to both God and country. Literature of the 19th century gave Joan a renewed voice. Friedrich Schiller, the German playwright, wrote Die Jungfrau von Orleans, the Maid of Orleans, in 1801, presenting her as a tragic heroine in a highly romanticized form. Though historically inaccurate, the play was enormously influential, inspiring operas and performances across Europe. In France, poets such as Victor Hugo invoked Joan as a symbol of national resilience, while Jules Michelet's historical writings emphasized her as the very soul of the French people. Music, too, embraced her story. Giuseppe Verdi's opera Giovanna d'Arco, first performed in 1845, dramatized her life with sweeping melodies, though again with liberties taken in plot and character. Later composers continued to turn to her as a subject, finding in her combination of faith and tragedy a powerful inspiration for song and stage. Visual art of the 19th century fixed Joan's image in the public imagination. Painters such as Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres and Jules Bastien Lepage portrayed her visions with dramatic intensity. Bastien Lepage's 1879 painting Joan of Arc, showing her listening to her voices in a rustic garden, captured both her humanity and her sense of divine calling. Sculptors, too, created statues of Joan, often depicting her in armor with a banner. By the late 19th century, monuments to Joan appeared in cities across France, testifying to her place as a national heroine. The 20th century brought Joan into new artistic media. Cinema, in particular, found in her story a compelling subject. Carl Theodor Dreyer's 1928 silent film, The Passion of Joan of Arc, remains one of the most celebrated films ever made. Using close-ups of Joan's face, the film captured the intensity of her trial and execution with stark realism. Renée Jean Falconetti's performance as Joan is still considered one of the greatest in film history. Later filmmakers, including Roberto Rossellini in 1954 and Robert Bresson in 1962, produced their own interpretations, each emphasizing different aspects of her faith and suffering. In theater, George Bernard Shaw's St. Joan, first performed in 1923, offered a modern reinterpretation. Shaw presented her not simply as a mystic or a martyr, but as a practical, intelligent leader whose visions empowered her to challenge authority. His play emphasized her humanity and her conflict with institutions, resistant to change, making her story resonate with 20th century themes of individuality and freedom. Joan's influence also extended into popular culture. She has appeared in novels, children's books, and even comic adaptations, her life retold in ways accessible to new generations. Musicians across genres have referenced her, from classical compositions to contemporary songs, using her as a symbol of courage or tragic destiny. Her image has often been used symbolically. In times of war, Joan has represented resistance and patriotism. In movements for women's rights, she has been celebrated as a trailblazer who broke through the restrictions of her gender. In spiritual contexts, she has stood as a model of faith and purity. The adaptability of her image is one reason for her enduring cultural presence. Art has not always idealized Joan. Some works have questioned her visions, her role in war, or her treatment by the church. Yet even critical portrayals acknowledge her extraordinary impact. Few figures in history have inspired such a vast and varied body of creative work. Today, Joan continues to appear in new forms of media. Films, novels, graphic novels, and digital art all retell her story for contemporary audiences. Each retelling emphasizes something different: her courage, her mysticism, her tragedy, but all recognize her as one of history's most compelling characters. As we reflect on this legacy, it is clear that Joan of Arc has transcended her own time. She has become a canvas upon which each age paints its own values and questions. From medieval ballads to modern cinema, her story remains alive, reshaped, but never forgotten. In the next segment, We will turn back to the historical setting of Joan's life, exploring the 100 Years' War in more detail, its causes, its course, and how Joan's intervention fits into the larger narrative of that long and destructive conflict. To fully understand Joan of Arc's significance, we must step back from her personal story and look closely at the larger conflict in which she lived and fought, the 100 Years' War. Spanning from 1337 to 1453, this long and destructive struggle between France and England shaped medieval Europe. Joan's role was brief in the scale of this war, yet it proved decisive in shifting momentum and restoring France's hope of survival. The origins of the 100 Years' War lay in disputes over succession and territory. In 1328, the French King Charles IV died without a direct male heir. The French nobility chose Philip VI of Valois as king, bypassing the claim of Edward III of England, who was the grandson of Philip IV of France through his mother. Edward contested this decision, asserting his right to the French crown. The result was a prolonged struggle for legitimacy, control of territory, and influence across the continent. The early phases of the war favored the English. They achieved dramatic victories at Crécy in 1346 and Poitiers in 1356, where their longbowmen devastated French knights. These triumphs allowed the English to seize large swaths of territory in northern and southwestern France. The Treaty of Bretigny in 1360 granted them extensive lands, though the peace was temporary. The war was not a single continuous conflict, but a series of campaigns, truces, and renewed hostilities. Both kingdoms suffered not only from battle, but from famine, plague, and political turmoil. The Black Death of the mid-14th century ravaged populations, adding to the chaos. France, in particular, faced periods of internal weakness, with rival factions vying for power and peasants suffering under heavy taxation. By the early 15th century, the English gained new strength under King Henry V. His victory at Agincourt in 1415 became legendary. With a smaller army, he defeated the French nobility decisively, once again proving the effectiveness of English longbowmen. This triumph allowed the English to press their advantage, leading to the Treaty of Troyes in 1420. That treaty recognized Henry V and his heirs as successors to the French throne, disinheriting the Dauphin Charles, the very man whom Joan would later support. The Treaty of Troyes created a dire situation for France, with the English occupying Paris and much of northern France, and with the Burgundians allied to England. The French crown seemed nearly lost. Charles, the Dauphin, retreated south of the Loire River, ruling only a fragment of the kingdom. His claim appeared weak, his resources limited, and his legitimacy undermined. It was in this moment of despair that Joan appeared. The siege of Orléans in 1428 to 1429 was a critical point in the war. If the city had fallen, the English would have gained full control of the Loire Valley, cutting off Charles from much of his remaining support. Morale in France was collapsing, and many doubted whether Charles could ever be crowned king. Joan's arrival and the lifting of the siege reversed this trajectory, breathing life into the French cause. Her victories along the Loire and the coronation of Charles at Reims in 1429 did not end the war, but they marked a turning point. For the first time in decades, France had regained momentum. The coronation restored legitimacy to Charles, undermining the claims of the English king Henry VI, who was still a child. The years after Joan's execution in 1431 saw continued fighting, but the tide slowly turned against England. The alliance with Burgundy, once a cornerstone of English strength, began to weaken. In 1435, the Treaty of Arras reconciled Charles VII with Philip the Good of Burgundy, depriving the English of their most powerful ally in France. This diplomatic victory, combined with military reforms, strengthened the French position. Charles VII reorganized his army, introducing more permanent forces and improving discipline. Over time, French troops, supported by artillery, gained superiority on the battlefield. By the 1440s and 1450s, the French steadily drove the English back, retaking Normandy and finally Bordeaux. The war concluded in 1453 with the Battle of Castillon, where French artillery secured a decisive victory. England retained only Calais, ending its long claim to the French crown. Joan's role in this larger narrative was brief. Just over 2 years from her arrival at Orléans in 1429 to her execution in 1431. Yet her impact was disproportionate to the length of her involvement. She reversed despair, restored legitimacy to Charles, and shifted the psychological balance of the war. Without her intervention, it is possible that the English might have consolidated their hold and prevented the eventual resurgence of France. The 100 Years' War left deep scars on both nations. In France, it created devastation, but also fostered a stronger sense of national identity, forged in resistance. Joan became central to that identity, remembered as the figure who embodied France's resilience. In England, the war's end led to disillusionment and contributed to internal strife, including the Wars of the Roses. By placing Joan within this context, we see how extraordinary her role was. She entered a conflict that had raged for nearly a century, and in a matter of months, altered its trajectory. Her presence did not end the war, but it changed its meaning, from a struggle France seemed destined to lose into a fight that France could and did win. In the next segment, we will return to Joan herself and explore the qualities of her leadership, how she inspired soldiers, how she maintained discipline, and what made her presence so powerful on the battlefield. To understand why Joan of Arc was so effective in war, we must look beyond the simple fact that she carried a banner or claimed divine guidance. Her presence on the battlefield was transformative. Soldiers who had been weary, divided, and disheartened found new courage in her leadership. Though she lacked formal military training, she demonstrated qualities of command that even seasoned generals respected. One of Joan's greatest strengths was inspiration. At Orléans, she entered a city that had endured months of siege. The defenders were exhausted, morale was low, and supplies were scarce. Her arrival, clad in armor and proclaiming God's support, electrified both soldiers and civilians. Accounts from the time record the joy and relief felt by the inhabitants when she rode into the city. For them, she was more than a commander. She was a sign that God had not abandoned France. In battle, Joan was not a strategist in the technical sense. The actual planning of maneuvers fell to experienced commanders like Jean d'Orléans, the bastard of Orléans, and La Hire. But Joan had a gift for urging bold action when others hesitated. Again and again, she pressed for immediate assaults rather than drawn-out sieges. Her argument was simple. God had promised victory, and delay showed lack of faith. At Orléans, at Jargeau, and at Patay, her insistence on attacking without hesitation helped turn the tide. Joan also played a unique role in discipline. Soldiers in the 15th century often behaved as much like marauders as fighters, looting towns, swearing, and abusing civilians. Joan demanded a higher standard. She urged her men to confess their sins, to attend Mass, and to avoid blasphemy and misconduct. She enforced rules against theft and mistreatment of non-combatants. This moral discipline distinguished her forces from others and strengthened the sense that they were fighting not only for land, but for God's justice. Her courage on the battlefield was undeniable. She placed herself in the front lines, carrying her banner into the thick of fighting. She was wounded more than once in the shoulder by an arrow at Orléans, and later in the thigh by a crossbow bolt during the failed attack on Paris. Yet she never retreated in panic. Even while injured, she encouraged her men to press forward. Soldiers, seeing her endure pain without yielding, drew strength from her example. Joan's banner itself was a powerful symbol, painted with the image of Christ in judgment and the names Jesus and Mary. It represented her mission. She often said she loved her banner more than her sword because it stood for God's presence with the army. In battle, it served as a rallying point. Men followed it with confidence, believing that as long as it flew, victory was assured. Her leadership extended beyond the battlefield. She wrote letters to towns and to enemy commanders, urging them to surrender peacefully. In these letters, she spoke with authority, declaring that God had commanded her to drive out the English. Her words carried both political and spiritual weight. To some, they were terrifying, to others, inspiring. Yet Joan was not reckless, though she urged boldness. She also listened to her commanders and adapted when necessary. She recognized the importance of supply lines, reinforcements, and timing. Her insistence on immediate action was tempered by practical considerations, showing that she was more than simply an idealist. The results of her leadership speak for themselves. Within months of her appearance, the French achieved a string of victories after years of defeat. The siege of Orléans was lifted. Towns along the Loire were retaken. At Patay, the English were crushed. The Dauphin was crowned king at Reims. These successes were not solely her doing, but her presence was the decisive factor that united divided commanders, inspired weary soldiers, and restored hope to a desperate cause. Even her enemies recognized her influence. English soldiers and commanders came to fear her, believing she wielded supernatural power. They mocked her as a witch, yet their fear betrayed their recognition of her effect. Facing Joan meant facing not just an army, but the conviction that God was on the other side. It is remarkable to consider that Joan was still a teenager throughout all this. At 17, she rode into Orléans. At 18, she led men in battle along the Loire. At 19, she stood trial in Rouen. Her youth made her achievements all the more extraordinary. Men who had fought for decades found themselves following a girl with no military background because she carried certainty, faith, and courage in a way none of them could match. Leadership is often about more than skill. It is about vision, presence, and the ability to inspire. Joan of Arc possessed these qualities in abundance. She gave France not only victories, but belief in itself again. That belief proved as powerful as any weapon on the field. In the next segment, we will look more closely at Joan's spirituality, her visions, her prayers, and her relationship with faith, and consider how her inner life sustained her through both triumph and suffering. Behind Joan of Arc's extraordinary military and political role was an inner life deeply shaped by faith. She was not simply a warrior who carried a banner, but a young woman who lived with a profound sense of divine presence. To understand Joan fully, we must explore her spirituality, her visions, her prayers, and the way her faith sustained her through both triumph and tragedy. Joan's visions began in her early teenage years, around the age of 13. She described hearing a voice accompanied by a great light while in her father's garden in Domrémy. At first, she was afraid, but soon she came to identify the voice as belonging to Saint Michael, the archangel. Later, she reported seeing and hearing Saint Catherine of Alexandria and Saint Margaret of Antioch. These saints, known for their courage, purity, and martyrdom, became her constant companions in her mission. The voices did not overwhelm Joan, but guided her gradually. At first, they instructed her to live a virtuous life, to remain pure, and to pray frequently. Over time, their messages became more specific. She was told to go to the Dauphin Charles, to aid him in reclaiming his kingdom, and to see him crowned at Reims. Joan believed these instructions without hesitation. To her, the voices were as real as the people around her, and she trusted them completely. Her descriptions of the visions were simple yet powerful. She spoke of light, radiance, and peace. She insisted that she recognized the saints by the authority and holiness they conveyed. When pressed during her trial to describe their physical form, she was cautious, refusing to give details that could be twisted against her. Instead, she emphasized the spiritual certainty they gave her. She said that she would rather die than deny that her voices came from God. Prayer was central to Joan's life. From childhood, she attended Mass regularly and spent hours in devotion. Even in the bustle of military camps, she made time for confession, prayer, and attending the sacraments. Soldiers reported that she would often kneel in prayer before battle, asking for God's guidance. Her insistence on piety extended to those around her. She encouraged her troops to pray, to confess their sins, and to respect clergy and civilians. Joan's spirituality was not abstract but intensely practical. She believed that God had called her to a specific mission, to save France and to crown its king. Her faith gave her not only courage, but a sense of absolute clarity. Where others hesitated, weighing risks and strategies, Joan pressed forward, convinced that God's will would prevail. This certainty often pushed French commanders to act boldly when they might otherwise have delayed. Her purity and virginity were also key elements of her spiritual identity. She called herself La Pucelle, meaning the maid, and saw her chastity as part of her divine mission. In medieval culture, virginity was often associated with holiness, and Joan's status as a maiden gave her credibility as the prophesied savior of France. Her insistence on wearing male clothing, which was controversial in her trial, was tied to this aspect. She explained that dressing in armor helped protect her chastity among soldiers. Joan's spirituality also sustained her through suffering. During her imprisonment in Rouen, she was kept in harsh conditions, chained and guarded by men. Yet even there, she prayed constantly, asking for strength and holding fast to her visions. When threatened with torture, she declared that even if her body were torn apart, she would not deny her voices. In her final moments at the stake, she cried out the name of Jesus, holding a cross and praying until the flames silenced her. Her trial testimony reveals much about her inner life. The notaries recorded her answers as she was questioned repeatedly about her visions. Though uneducated, she spoke with clarity and conviction, often turning the questions back on her interrogators. She never wavered in her insistence that her voices were from God. When asked if she was in God's grace, a question designed as a trap, she answered, "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God keep me there." This reply avoided theological error, while expressing complete trust in God. For centuries, scholars have debated the nature of her visions. Some view them as genuine divine revelations, consistent with her canonization as a saint. Others suggest psychological or medical explanations, such as hallucinations caused by illness. Still others interpret them as deeply sincere religious experiences shaped by her culture and her devotion. Regardless of interpretation, what cannot be denied is their impact. Joan believed in them utterly, and that belief gave her the courage to act as she did. Her spirituality was not passive but active. It did not lead her into isolation, but into the heart of France's struggle. Her voices did not call her to a cloister, but to the battlefield, to rally armies, and to confront kings and judges. In this way, Joan embodied a unique form of holiness, one that combined mystical vision with direct action. Her faith also made her death meaningful. To her captors, she was a condemned heretic. To her followers, she was a martyr who had remained true to God even unto the fire. The fact that she went to her death praying, holding a cross, and refusing to renounce her voices cemented this perception. Joan's spirituality then was the foundation of her entire life. It guided her from Domrémy to Orléans, sustained her in prison, and carried her to the stake. Without it, she would not have had the certainty, courage, or endurance that defined her. In the next segment, we will consider the role of gender in Joan's story, how her identity as a young woman shaped her opportunities, her challenges, and the way she was perceived by both supporters and enemies. Joan of Arc's story cannot be separated from the fact that she was a young woman living in a deeply patriarchal society. In 15th century Europe, women were expected to remain within domestic roles, managing households, raising children, and obeying fathers or husbands. The world of knights, armies, and politics was reserved almost entirely for men. Joan's rise to prominence as a military leader, clothed in armor and commanding soldiers, was therefore not only extraordinary, but unsettling for many of her contemporaries. From the beginning, Joan's gender shaped the way people understood her. The very prophecies that paved the way for her acceptance, rumors that France would be saved by a maiden, show how medieval culture linked femininity with divine intervention. Virgins, in particular, carried symbolic weight in Christian tradition. Biblical figures, like the Virgin Mary, and saints like Catherine of Alexandria, were revered for their purity and steadfastness. Joan's insistence on calling herself La Pucelle, the Maid, connected her identity to this lineage of holy virgins. Her virginity was not only a personal vow, but also a political and spiritual sign of legitimacy. Yet Joan was not simply a passive maiden. She dressed in armor, rode horses, and led men into battle. Her choice to wear male clothing was both practical and symbolic. In military camps, surrounded by soldiers, it protected her from harassment and assault. It also marked her as distinct, set apart for her divine mission. To her, this was obedience to God's will. To her enemies, it was a scandal. The trial in Rouen returned again and again to this issue, treating it as proof of her disobedience to church law. The reactions she provoked were mixed. For soldiers and common people, Joan's gender made her role even more astonishing. That a teenage girl could inspire men hardened by years of war was seen as evidence of divine power. Her difference from ordinary commanders gave her presence an aura of holiness. She was not just another knight, she was something beyond the expected order, a living sign of God's intervention. For her opponents, however, her gender became a weapon against her. English and Burgundian critics called her unnatural, accused her of witchcraft, and claimed she was possessed by demons. To them, a woman in armor, who led men into battle, was a disruption of the God-ordained hierarchy. By framing her as a witch or heretic, they sought to discredit not only her, but also the French cause she represented. Within the French court, her gender posed challenges as well. Some nobles resented her rapid rise and her influence over Charles VII. That she was a peasant made her unusual enough. That she was a woman made her even more difficult to accept. Yet her victories left little room for denial. Her gender, which might have excluded her from leadership, instead magnified the impact of her success. Joan herself did not frame her mission in terms of gender rebellion. She did not argue for women's equality or seek to challenge social roles broadly. Instead, she presented herself as chosen by God for a unique purpose. Her clothing, her command, and her actions were all justified in her mind by divine command. In this way, she was able to act outside the norms of her society while still grounding her authority in the strongest possible source, God Himself. Her gender also shaped the way she was remembered after her death. For centuries, she was celebrated as a virgin martyr, in line with early Christian saints who had died for their purity and their faith. Artists often depicted her in armor, but with an emphasis on her youth and innocence. In modern times, however, interpretations expanded. Feminist thinkers saw her as an early example of a woman breaking barriers, claiming authority in a male world. Her defiance of traditional roles became an inspiration to later movements seeking gender equality. The complexity of Joan's gender identity continues to provoke discussion. Was she a woman who simply took on male roles for necessity? Was her cross-dressing an expression of something deeper, a way of embodying both feminine and masculine qualities in her mission? Historians debate these questions, recognizing that Joan's choices were radical in her time and remain fascinating today. What is clear is that Joan's identity as a woman was central to both her rise and her fall. It helped her fulfill prophecies, gave her an aura of divine selection, and made her victories all the more astonishing. At the same time, it exposed her to suspicion, ridicule, and ultimately condemnation by a court determined to frame her difference as sin. Joan's story shows how gender shaped opportunity, perception, and power in medieval society. She succeeded not by rejecting her identity, but by reinterpreting it, presenting herself as the maiden chosen by God, whose purity and obedience allowed her to do what no man could. In the next segment, we will look at Joan's influence on French national identity, how she became not only a saint, but a symbol of France itself, embodying unity, resilience, and resistance through the centuries. Over the centuries, Joan of Arc has become more than a saint or a historical figure. She has become one of the most enduring symbols of France itself. Her image, her story, and her sacrifice have been invoked time and again to represent unity, resilience, and national pride. Few figures in history embody the spirit of a nation as completely as the Maid of Orléans. The foundation for Joan's role as a national symbol was laid during her lifetime. At Orléans, she had rallied not just soldiers, but an entire population, convincing them that France could be saved. Her victories, followed by the coronation of Charles VII at Reims, restored legitimacy to the French monarchy at a moment when it seemed doomed. Even her death at Rouen, intended by her enemies to break French morale, instead planted the seeds of her martyrdom. To many French people, she became the embodiment of their struggle against foreign domination. Her rehabilitation in 1456 reinforced this identity. By declaring her trial null and void, the Church officially restored her honor. For the French crown, this was a vindication of its legitimacy. Charles VII owed his coronation to Joan, and with her name cleared, the foundation of his rule was strengthened. From then on, Joan was woven into the story of France's survival and resurgence after the 100 Years' War. As centuries passed, Joan's image evolved alongside the nation itself. During the wars of religion in the 16th century, both Catholics and Protestants invoked her. Catholics emphasized her sanctity and martyrdom, while Protestants admired her as a patriotic figure who rose from humble origins. Her story provided a rare symbol that could cross religious divides, even in an era of bitter conflict. In the 19th century, Joan's role as a national icon deepened. After the turmoil of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic era, the country sought figures who could unite it. Historians like Jules Michelet celebrated her as the soul of France, the daughter of the people who defended the nation with purity and courage. Artists and writers joined in, portraying her as a symbol of national renewal. Statues of Joan appeared across France, especially in Orléans, where her annual festival became a patriotic celebration as much as a religious one. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870–71 gave Joan's image new urgency. After France's defeat and the loss of Alsace-Lorraine, she was invoked as a reminder that the nation could endure hardship and rise again. Nationalists pointed to her as proof of the French spirit's resilience. At the same time, the Catholic Church supported devotion to her as a model of faith. Thus Joan bridged secular and religious spheres, serving as both a saint of the Church and a heroine of the nation. In the 20th century, her symbolism expanded further. During World War I, French soldiers carried her image into battle, and posters invoked her as a protector of the homeland. When she was canonized in 1920, the timing coincided with the war's end, reinforcing her role as both saint and national defender. Her figure appeared on war memorials, and her feast day became a moment of civic pride as well as religious devotion. World War II brought her symbolism into even sharper relief. Both the Free French, under Charles de Gaulle, and the Vichy regime, under Marshal Pétain, claimed Joan as their inspiration. For de Gaulle, she represented resistance and the refusal to accept foreign occupation. For Pétain, she embodied Catholic tradition and loyalty to the soil of France. The fact that opposing sides both claimed her shows how deeply embedded she had become in the French imagination. In modern France, Joan remains a powerful but sometimes contested symbol. The annual celebrations in Orléans still honor her with processions, speeches, and civic events. Political movements of different kinds continue to invoke her name. Some see her as the protector of the nation against outside threats. Others emphasize her as a figure of unity who rose above divisions. What makes Joan unique as a national symbol is the way her story combines multiple layers of meaning. She was a peasant, representing the common people. She was a woman, standing out in a male-dominated world. She was a warrior, embodying courage. She was a martyr, representing sacrifice. And she was a saint, embodying faith. Each of these identities contributes to her lasting resonance. Even today, when debates over French identity are complex and sometimes divisive, Joan's figure continues to serve as a touchstone. Streets, schools, and monuments bear her name. She is invoked in political speeches, in cultural works, and in everyday conversation as shorthand for patriotism, sacrifice, and resilience. Her journey from Domrémy to Orléans, from the stake in Rouen to sainthood in Rome, mirrors the journey of France itself, marked by suffering, resilience, and eventual triumph. Her image is not static, but living, constantly reinterpreted by each generation. Yet, at the core, she remains the Maid of Orléans, the young woman who believed she was called by God to save her nation, and did. In the next segment, we will broaden our view and examine Joan's global legacy, how she has been remembered and honored outside of France, and why her story continues to resonate across cultures, religions, and nations around the world. Though Joan of Arc's story is rooted in 15th century France, her legacy has long since spread far beyond the borders of her homeland. Over the centuries, she has come to be admired across Europe, the Americas, and even further afield. Her story resonates in part because it speaks to universal themes: faith, courage, sacrifice, and resistance against overwhelming odds. As a result, Joan has become not only a French heroine and Catholic saint, but also a global icon. In Europe, Joan's influence was strongest first in France, but her reputation grew steadily in other countries as her story circulated in chronicles, plays, and later historical works. In Germany, Schiller's play Die Jungfrau von Orleans in 1801 transformed her into a romantic heroine, dramatizing her courage in ways that appealed across borders. In England, where she had once been vilified as a witch and heretic, perceptions shifted gradually. By the 19th century, even English writers and artists began to admire her bravery and tragedy. Today, she is honored in England not as an enemy, but as one of history's remarkable figures. In Italy, composers like Verdi adapted her life into operas, presenting her story to audiences who might have known little of the 100 Years' War, but who were captivated by her blend of mysticism and heroism. In Spain and other Catholic countries, her canonization in 1920 was celebrated as the elevation of a holy woman whose life of purity and sacrifice was seen as exemplary. Across the Atlantic, Joan of Arc found an eager audience in the Americas. In Canada, with its deep French Catholic roots, devotion to her spread quickly after her beatification in 1909 and canonization in 1920. Churches were dedicated in her honor, and she became a patroness of French-Canadian identity. In the United States, she was embraced both by Catholic immigrants and by broader society as a symbol of courage. Statues of Joan stand in cities such as New York and New Orleans, where she is remembered not only as a saint, but also as a figure of inspiration in a diverse cultural landscape. Latin America, with its strong Catholic traditions, also adopted Joan into devotional life. Her image appears in churches and schools, and her feast day is marked in many places with special services. Her story appealed particularly to communities that saw in her an example of standing against oppression, a theme that resonated in regions with histories of colonialism and struggle. In Asia and Africa, Joan's presence arrived through missionary activity and cultural exchange. Catholic communities in the Philippines, Vietnam, and parts of Africa invoked her as a saint who represented purity, bravery, and obedience to God's call. While not as deeply woven into local traditions as in France or Canada, she nonetheless became part of the global network of Catholic devotion, showing the reach of her canonization. Her global appeal has also been reinforced by art and media. Films like Dreyer's The Passion of Joan of Arc and Bresson's The Trial of Joan of Arc were shown internationally, introducing her story to audiences far from France. Plays, novels, and operas based on her life have been translated into many languages. Her image, whether in armor or at the stake, has become instantly recognizable worldwide. What makes Joan particularly remarkable as a global figure is her ability to transcend specific cultural and religious boundaries. Catholics venerate her as a saint. Protestants admire her steadfastness of conscience. Secular admirers respect her patriotism and courage. Feminist thinkers celebrate her defiance of gender roles. Nationalists and resistance movements see her as a symbol of defying foreign domination. Across continents, groups with very different aims have found in Joan something to inspire. Her universality lies in the combination of her youth, her conviction, and her tragic death. She was a teenager who believed in a mission greater than herself, who acted with courage despite overwhelming odds, and who was executed unjustly. Such a story resonates across time and place because it speaks to fundamental human experiences: the struggle for justice, the call to stand firm, and the price of faithfulness. In the 21st century, Joan continues to appear in global contexts. Schools, organizations, and even military units bear her name. International pilgrimages bring visitors to Domrémy, Orléans, and Rouen. Her life is taught not only in France, but in world history courses, ensuring that her story reaches new generations across the globe. Thus, Joan of Arc, once a peasant girl from a small French village, has become part of world heritage. Her life belongs not only to France, but to all who value courage, faith, and the power of conviction. In the next segment, we will explore how Joan's story has been used as a source of inspiration for social and political movements, from revolutions to struggles for human rights, showing how her example continues to guide action far beyond her own era. Across the centuries, Joan of Arc has been more than a saint or national heroine. Her story has repeatedly been invoked as a source of inspiration for social and political movements. From revolutions to struggles for human rights, leaders and ordinary people alike have turned to her as a model of courage, conviction, and resistance against oppression. One of the earliest uses of Joan as a political symbol came during the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century. Revolutionaries admired her as a daughter of the people who rose from humble origins to challenge kings and nobles. Though her mission had ultimately served to crown Charles VII, her peasant background and her defiance of authority allowed revolutionaries to reinterpret her as a champion of the people rather than of monarchy. Pamphlets and speeches celebrated her as a figure who embodied the French spirit of resistance to tyranny. In the 19th century, with nationalism on the rise across Europe, Joan became a symbol of the nation itself. For the French, she embodied unity and resilience after centuries of turmoil. Her ability to rally a divided and demoralized kingdom made her an example of how France could endure hardship and emerge stronger. This nationalist image grew even stronger after the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71, when France sought symbols of identity in the face of defeat. Joan's story of suffering and ultimate triumph offered hope that the nation could recover its strength. Women's movements also found inspiration in Joan. From the 19th century onward, feminists pointed to her as an example of female leadership in a world dominated by men. Her refusal to accept traditional roles, her choice to wear armor and command armies, and her ability to influence politics all served as proof that women could take on roles far beyond the domestic sphere. Some suffragists in both Europe and North America cited Joan as evidence that women deserved a voice in public life, invoking her as a symbol of strength and independence. Resistance movements in times of war and occupation have also drawn upon her legacy. During World War I, French soldiers carried her image into battle, believing she was a heavenly protector. Propaganda posters depicted her leading the French nation against invaders, just as she had done in the 15th century. During World War II, her symbolism became even more contested. The Free French under Charles de Gaulle saw her as the patroness of resistance to Nazi occupation, while the Vichy regime under Marshal Pétain invoked her as a model of Catholic tradition and loyalty to the homeland. That both sides claimed her shows the versatility of her image. Beyond France, other nations and movements have invoked Joan as well. In the United States, she was admired as a figure of moral courage and faith, and her story was used to inspire both religious devotion and patriotic spirit. In Canada, particularly among French Canadians, she became a symbol of cultural survival and resistance to assimilation. In Eastern Europe, where struggles against foreign domination were frequent, her life served as a reminder that even small nations could resist powerful oppressors through courage and faith. Civil rights leaders and human rights advocates have also turned to Joan's example. Her trial, with its unfair procedures and political manipulation, has been remembered as a symbol of injustice. Those who campaign against wrongful imprisonment or persecution often point to her as a reminder of the human cost when power overrides truth. Her story underscores the need for fairness and the danger of corrupt authority. In modern feminist and gender discussions, Joan remains a touchstone. She is admired not only for her leadership, but also for the way she blurred traditional gender boundaries. Her insistence on wearing male clothing, once used against her in trial, is now often interpreted as a statement of independence and self-determination. Activists who challenge rigid gender roles find in her an early example of someone who lived authentically in defiance of expectation. Her inspiration extends even into popular activism. Artists, writers, and musicians who speak out against injustice often invoke Joan's courage. Protesters have carried her image on banners, seeing her as a symbol of standing firm against powerful adversaries, whether in the context of political resistance, women's rights, or cultural pride. She continues to provide a story that motivates action. What makes Joan so adaptable as a symbol is the universality of her qualities. She was young, humble, and seemingly powerless, yet she changed the course of history. She stood firm in her convictions, even when threatened with death. She accepted suffering without abandoning her mission. These traits can be applied to many struggles, making her an enduring figure for those who fight for justice, dignity, and freedom. Joan's story is thus not only one of the past, but of the present. Each new generation finds in her life lessons for its own battles. She continues to inspire movements that seek to challenge oppression, to empower the marginalized, and to remind the world that courage and conviction can arise from the most unexpected places. In the next segment, we will reflect on the psychological and human dimensions of Joan, what it meant to be a teenage girl at the center of such extraordinary events, and how her humanity shines through even the legends and symbolism built around her. So far, we have looked at Joan of Arc as a saint, a soldier, a national heroine, and a symbol. Yet beneath all of these roles was a human being, a teenage girl from a small village who found herself at the center of one of the most turbulent periods in European history. To understand her fully, we must pause and consider the human dimension of her life, the psychological weight of her mission, the emotions she must have felt, and the extraordinary courage it took simply to endure. Joan was born in 1412 in Domrémy, a small rural community. Life there was simple and hard. Her family were peasants working the land for survival. From all accounts, Joan grew up like other village children, tending animals, helping her parents, and attending church. There is no evidence that she received formal schooling. She could not read or write, though she knew her prayers by heart. What set her apart was not privilege or education, but conviction. When Joan began to hear voices around the age of 13, she was still a child. Imagine the weight of being told, as a young teenager, that God had chosen you to save your country. Most would have dismissed such experiences or been crushed by their enormity. Joan accepted them with simplicity and faith. She did not rush immediately into action, but spent years reflecting before she finally left Domrémy to seek out the Dauphin. This shows both patience and seriousness. She did not act on impulse, but on deep conviction. When she arrived at court, she was just 17. Surrounded by nobles, soldiers, and clerics, she had no status, no wealth, and no training. Yet she spoke with confidence, insisting she was sent by God. For a teenage peasant girl to claim such authority in front of men who had spent their lives in power was nothing short of extraordinary. Her courage in those encounters reveals not only her faith, but her remarkable composure. On the battlefield, Joan faced not only the danger of combat, but also the psychological strain of leading men far older and more experienced than herself. Soldiers looked to her for guidance, and she had to embody the certainty they needed. She carried her banner in the thick of fighting, a visible target, knowing she could be killed at any moment. She was wounded more than once, yet she returned to the front. Such endurance at such a young age is difficult to imagine. Her humanity also appears in moments of fear and doubt. During her trial, under the threat of the stake, she faltered and signed an abjuration. For that brief moment, fear overcame her faith. But rather than diminishing her, this makes her more real. She was not an unshakable figure of stone, but a young woman who felt fear like anyone else. What makes her remarkable is that she quickly regained her conviction, returning to her mission even though it meant certain death. Throughout her imprisonment, she faced isolation, humiliation, and constant pressure. She was chained, deprived of the company of women, and interrogated for hours. Yet even in these conditions, she retained her dignity. She prayed, she spoke with clarity, and she never denied the core of her mission. Her strength lay not in physical power, but in her unbroken spirit. Joan's story also reminds us of the cost of her mission. She gave up everything, her home, her family, her safety, for the call she believed was from God. She never married, never had children, never returned to the quiet life of Domrémy. In a few short years, she passed from obscurity to fame, from triumph to martyrdom. By the age of 19, her life was over. The brevity of her journey makes it all the more poignant. Her humanity shines through in small details recorded at her trial. She asked for Mass. She wept when she thought she had failed. She longed for the comfort of the Church's sacraments. She requested a cross to hold at her execution. These are not the gestures of a distant legend, but of a living, breathing girl, facing unimaginable pressure with extraordinary courage. It is easy to see Joan only as a symbol, to place her on a pedestal as saint or heroine. But remembering her humanity allows us to grasp the true depth of her courage. She was not invulnerable, not without fear, not untouched by suffering. She was a teenager, with all the vulnerability that implies, who nonetheless stood firm against kings, bishops, and armies. Her story resonates so deeply because it shows what a single person, even one without power, can achieve when guided by conviction. Joan's humanity makes her relatable. Her courage makes her exceptional. Together, they make her unforgettable. In the next and final segment, we will bring Joan's story to a close, reflecting on her life, her legacy, and why, centuries after her death, she continues to inspire people across the world. As we reach the end of Joan of Arc's story, it is worth pausing to reflect on the extraordinary arc of her life and the enduring nature of her legacy. She was born in 1412, in a small, obscure village. She heard voices that she believed came from God. She left her home at 17, entered the world of kings and generals, and changed the course of a war that had already lasted nearly a century. Within 2 years, she crowned a king, lifted sieges, inspired victories, and gave a nation hope. At 19, she was condemned, executed, and silenced by fire. Yet her story did not end in that Rouen marketplace in May 1431. Her life was short, but its impact was immense. In the narrowest sense, Joan's mission was political and military, to see Charles VII crowned and to turn the tide against the English. In this, she succeeded. The coronation at Reims, achieved against great odds, restored legitimacy to the French crown and laid the foundation for the eventual victory of France in the 100 Years' War. Without Joan, it is possible that Charles would never have been crowned, and the French cause might have collapsed. But Joan's significance extends far beyond strategy or politics. She became a symbol of faith, courage, and sacrifice. Her presence inspired soldiers to fight with renewed confidence. Her example encouraged discipline and piety, and her very existence showed that hope could emerge in the darkest of times. She was a teenager, untrained and inexperienced, yet she carried herself with a conviction that shook the confidence of armies and unsettled the might of kingdoms. Her trial and death, intended to erase her influence, only magnified it. The injustice of her condemnation, the courage of her final prayers, and the cruelty of her execution transformed her into a martyr. In the eyes of the people, she had died not as a heretic, but as a faithful servant of God. The rehabilitation of 1456 confirmed this, declaring her innocent and exposing the corruption of the court that condemned her. Centuries later, her canonization in 1920 placed her among the saints of the Catholic Church, confirming what many had long believed, that Joan's life was an extraordinary witness to faith and obedience. She became the patron saint of France, a figure honored not only in churches, but in national ceremonies, festivals, and monuments. Her feast day on May 30 remains a time to remember her sacrifice. Joan's legacy has been endlessly reinterpreted. To some, she is above all a saint. To others, she is a national heroine. To feminists, she is a pioneer who challenged gender norms. To political movements, she is a symbol of resistance. To artists and writers, she is an inexhaustible source of inspiration. Each generation finds in her story qualities that speak to its own struggles. Yet across all these interpretations, the core remains unchanged. A young woman of conviction, who stood firm when all the forces of the world pressed against her. Her humanity makes her story powerful. She was not born into privilege. She was not trained for war. She was not protected from fear or suffering. She was an ordinary girl who believed in something greater than herself and who dared to act upon it. That is why her life resonates so deeply, centuries after her death. Joan of Arc's journey reminds us that history is not only shaped by kings, armies, and treaties, but also by individuals who choose courage over fear, faith over doubt, and action over silence. Her banner no longer flies on battlefields, but her spirit continues to inspire. And so we conclude. Joan of Arc, the peasant girl from Domrémy, the maid of Orléans, the warrior saint of France, lived only 19 years. Yet, in that brief span, she achieved what few in history have done. She left a legacy that transcends time, place, and circumstance. She remains, even today, a voice calling across the centuries, a voice of courage, conviction, and hope. With that, the story of Joan of Arc comes to a close. Her life has been told and retold, remembered and reinterpreted, but at its heart, it remains the same, the story of a young woman who believed she was sent by God, who acted with courage, and who changed the course of history. And though she died in fire, her memory endures, undimmed by the centuries, eternal as a symbol of faith and resilience.